grilled Tim, so don't worry.
He's figuring out his different ways he knows you all.
Yeah, it is. Good. It is. We had fun.
I tried. I didn't have his phone number. I would have called him and asked him. No, I don't see him come in. I should have invited him.
Harold was originally going to be here.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
So I guess we'll need the board chairs for.
it's okay to do this. Yeah, I'll take it. No, it's all right. I've got him in here somewhere. I'll get to it.
I was guessing when I saw 4 chairs. Thank you.
I'm here. Thank you. How you doing today?
Oh, that does sound
Hi, Harold. Good to see you.
How's everybody doing? I couldn't be there with you.
The other board members here, Gabisa and Pamela and Brady.
Great. Excellent. Excellent.
So you know, Harold, there's a name tag of yours.
I will put a name tag on just to make sure I feel included. How are you? I hope you folk are doing well.
Yeah, right up front, ask all the commissioners,
Okay.
including. Can they hear Harold when he speaks? I think.
I think so.
Okay.
The chair may call upon you to introduce yourself, Harold.
Okay. That'd be great. I'm sitting here looking forward to it. Thanks, Jabisa.
My name is Pamela Anderson.
Are Jim and Juan Carlos even here? I don't see them. Did somebody tell me? Oh, I thought they were going to be here.
I
See
was
the
asking
award.
her this morning.
Oh, I was looking forward to. Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm Brady Deaton, and I'm chair of the Board on International Food and Agriculture Development, and I welcome you to this event here at the World Food Prize. And let me just begin by saying we're here at the World Food Prize, of course, to recognize the 2017 World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Akin Adesina. And I'm going to ask Gabisa Jada in a few minutes. We'll tell you a little bit more about him, but it's because of the wonderful contribution of such luminary scientists and contributors to global food security that we are here and are able to celebrate in so many ways and share ideas with you. We're here in person, roughly expecting about 100 here in the room and another 100 or so online. And I want to emphasize that for those who are not here in the room and want to ask questions, you can use Twitter with the hashtag BIFAD. So to those of you out there around the country, around the world that are listening in, we welcome you and look forward to engagement with you in this session of BIFAD. We have with us today actually 3, you don't see them all, but 3 other members of the board. And let me begin. I want to ask them to introduce themselves. We have online Harold Martin, the Chancellor at North Carolina A&T. Harold, welcome to the session.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon to all in attendance. Again, my name is Harold Martin. I'm a member of the BIFAD board, and I'm Chancellor here at North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Thank you, Harold. Gabisa?
Gabisa Jeta, Purdue University, faculty member there, and also director of a Center for Global Food Security at Purdue, and a member of the BIFAD board as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Pamela Anderson. I served as the Director General of SIP for a decade, and then as the Director of the Ag Program at the Gates Foundation. I am now happily retired, but serving on the BIFAD board.
Other board members who could not be with us because of intervening business was Dr. Waded Cruzado, the president of Montana State University, and James Ash, with the Food and Agribusiness Group leader at Husch Blackwell law firm in Kansas City. And the other person who could not be with us is Dr. Carrie Fowler with the Global Crop Diversity Trust until recently. And let me say we want to send best wishes to him because he's facing health challenges that prevented him from being at the meeting here today. So to Dr. Fowler, we send a special greetings from the members of BIFAD and from those of you who are participating with us in this session today. In the audience, I believe we have some Borlaug Leap Fellows. If they're here, would you all please stand up and let us thank you for being with us today. I know you're individually going to be introduced at a number of sessions, including, I believe, noon tomorrow, when I will and others here will be with you. But we welcome you and point to you because you really are our future. And so when we look at you, we're trying to interact with you in a way that gives you the best of our thinking and to draw on the best of your thinking and the work that we are doing, and then look forward to the many contributions you will make to global food security in the future. So congratulations. Thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate it. You know, we're focused in our session generally today on the topic of resilience because this topic is a very important one for USAID, and from the standpoint of our board, we believe that it's critical that we continue to look at those systems that can enable us to address the critical problems of poverty, of global food security, of improved nutrition, and of targeting those around the world who are the most vulnerable. We have developed monitoring systems, and it's critical that those continue to be strengthened. There are critical measurement issues that each of you who've been involved in research, and you'll be hearing in some detail today some examples of this. And those of us from the university community know how vital good research methodology, effective measurement, and a systems transdisciplinary, if you will, kind of focus on some of these issues is so critical. This has been embraced by USAID, and it will continue to remain an important point of concern for BIFAD as we go forward. So we'll be looking forward to working with you as we look to the future and drawing on a broader range of our university colleagues because, of course, the board, when it was created in 1975, was designed to serve, to link our higher education system with what USAID is doing worldwide, and we want to strengthen that in every way possible. Let me also introduce from USAID, Clara Cohen, who's Executive Director of BIFAD. Clara, thank you for all that you do and strengthen us in so many ways. Chief Scientist from USAID and our partner in so many ways, Rob Bertram is here. Rob, also, just if you would, thank you for being with us. We have other staff, of course, with USAID. Kristen Franklin is an assistant here who will be working with us throughout. And Samantha Alvis from APLU. Samantha is in charge of making sure we get all the distance work done and filling in a bit also for some of the work that Mark Varner with APLU would normally be with us. And Mark is in the background, I hope, listening in, and will be with us as we go through the day today. I will turn now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Gebisa Ejeta, who's a plant scientist at Purdue University, and of course, recipient of the World Food Prize, and has also received a special award in science from the President of Ethiopia. Gebisa has achieved tremendous acclaim as a scientist. He's been a stalwart member of so many advisory groups dealing with food security around the world, and is now, of course, has been working with us for the last several years as a member of BIFAD. Dr. Ejeta is going to introduce and tell you something about the prize that BIFAD gives each year to senior scientists who are contributing to world food security and also to students who are involved in this process. Gebisa, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm actually standing in for the chair of the subcommittee on awards and prizes within BIFAD, President Wadid Cruzado, president of Montana State University. She was unable to be with us because of urgent duty and responsibility at the university this week. And I've been asked to stand in for President Cruzado. The BIFAD board considered it a special privilege to honor research scientists in general, but particularly research scientists working with food and agriculture, in this particular instance, scientists within the innovation labs of Feed the Future. At the request of the BIFAD chair, and before going into announcing the award, I would like to make a couple of observations about this year's laureate of the World Food Prize, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina of the African Development Bank. He's the president of African Development Bank, a native of Nigeria. I have known Dr. Adesina for a few decades now, since he was a graduate student at Purdue University. Very fitting to recognize Akin in this particular session because of the fact that his graduate degrees, both master's and PhD, were from Purdue University, and they were, at the time, were supported by funds from the U.S. Agency for International Development through the collaborative research support programs. He received his master's in the area of international trade, working with a colleague there, Phil Abbott, of the professor in ag economics, and his PhD was under the supervision of Professor John Sanders, who a colleague there as well, and he worked in the area of international ag development and technology, economics of technology change. Akin was given a postdoctoral fellowship upon finishing his degree from Purdue University, and he became a postdoctoral fellow working with Rockefeller Foundation, initially assigned at the ICRISAT, International Crop Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics. And from then he moved on to IITA as a principal scientist. A few years later, he moved on to WARDA, the Rice Institute there. And then a few years later after that, Rockefeller Foundation called him back to be associate director for their Africa program, and he was stationed in Malawi and in charge of the market and economics program in the Africa program of Rockefeller Foundation. I worked with him when he was there, as I was on the advisory board of the Rockefeller Foundation's Africa program at the time. Akin was an outstanding student, one of the brightest students on the faculty, I was told. In the Ag Economics department, he was one of those that have been pushed and encouraged to go on the more quantitative path, and took courses from economics department. And as Akin talks about those early training, these quantitative trainings have been of tremendous value to him in the work that he had done, both as the Minister of Agriculture in terms of the initiatives that he established there, but also the work that he had done in many places within the CGIAR. I again got an opportunity to work with Dr. Adesina when he was in Nairobi at the Rockefeller Foundation office at the time that I had requested to take a sabbatical leave from Purdue University, and Gary Tennyson at Rockefeller asked if I could come and help with the establishment of the Alliance for Green Revolution for Africa, a partnership between Rockefeller and Gates Foundation. It was truly a remarkable time for all of us. I think Akin Adesina, Peter Matlin, Rose Steiner from Gates Foundation, Joe DeVries, worked together. We reported to Gary Tonneson at Rockefeller and Rajiv Shah at the board at Gates Foundation. After AGRA was established, I returned to my duties at Purdue University. Akin assumed the vice presidency as vice president for policy, working with Mr. Kofi Annan, who was the president of the Alliance for Green Revolution for Africa. And the two of them really enhanced AGRA to what it is today, working with the leadership there at AGRA. I may just say that Akin has always been a very capable scientist and leader with breadth and depth in knowledge, and as I can tell you ahead of time, as you get to hear him, he is an incredible speaker, oratorical in the true sense of that, but full of substance and vision for Africa's agricultural development. With that, I will switch to my primary duty of announcing the latest recipient of the BIFAD Award for Scientific Excellence in the Feed and Future Innovation Lab. The award this year is given to two outstanding scientists and graduate students from Niger. The awards will be presented, unfortunately not today, in the coming months at the next BIFAD public meeting, and we'll be pleased to hear a lecture from the winners regarding the details of their research work. The principal criteria of the award are: one, demonstrated creativity in bringing about long-lasting sustainable improvement in international food and agriculture. Second, evidence of sustainable increases in food security and economic growth without degradation of the environment. And third, success in communicating and disseminating the results to other peoples and other places. BIFAD is pleased to announce that the Senior Research Award goes to a team of scientists from Caribbean and Central America, Dr. James Beaver of University of Puerto Rico, and Dr. Juan Carlos Rosas of Zamorano. The researchers have collaborated. These individual scientists could earn these prize award on their own, but BIFAD is recognizing them for a collaborative work, even though the work that has been cited for the award is their work for the last 10 years. These individuals have been collaborating for almost 30 years. These collaborative teams' discoveries have provided significant advances to our understanding of bean golden yellow mosaic virus and web blight. These diseases are critical constraints in growing common beans in their regions. The researchers have released over 60 bean cultivars for improvements in yield, quality, and stability of production in 6 Central American countries, including Puerto Rico, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Panama. Their most recent research included studying mechanisms of how abiotic stress affects both common and tepary beans. Some of their disease-resistant varieties of beans now also have heat and drought tolerance. Dr. Beaver and Rosas have made significant contributions to improving the livelihood of the poor through scaling up and disseminating their innovations. They are focused on participatory plant breeding approaches. Not only are the genetics of their bean seeds used, but their approach to including smallholder farmers' inputs in several varietal selection is now also adopted worldwide. Beyond their own common research accomplishments, Drs. Beaver and Rosas have conducted numerous training programs for graduate students in their field. Their accomplishments now transcend their own labs, with a cadre of well-trained researchers working in universities, national and international agricultural research organizations, in the private sector in Angola, Ecuador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The team was supported by bean cowpea crisp in the early years from '84 to 2006, and later on in the dry grain pulses crisp from '07 to 2012, and since 2012 by the Future Innovation Lab for Collaborative Research in Grain Legumes and the Climate Resilient Beans Project. Dr. Beaver is a professor at the University of Puerto Rico. He received his PhD and MS degrees from the University of Illinois and his BS degrees from Purdue University. Among his many awards, I would like to cite a few that Dr. Beaver received the Bean Improvement Cooperative's Meritorious Service and Distinguished Achievement Award, a 2015 Certificate of Recognition from the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico for Bean Research Contributions, and the 2007 Arturo Roche Award for Excellence in Research presented by the Dean and Director of the College of Agricultural Sciences of the University of Puerto Rico. He was named a Fellow of the Crop Science Society of America in 2011. A major part of Dr. Beaver's legacy are over 50 master's level students that he had mentored who are now successful researchers in universities, national agricultural research organizations, international agricultural research centers, and the private sector around the world. Dr. Juan Carlos is a professor and interim director of research at Escuela Agricola Panamericana in Zamorano, Honduras. He received his PhD and MS degrees from the University of Wisconsin and his BS degrees from the National Agrarian University in Lima, Peru. Among his awards, noteworthy awards received by him include the Bean Cowpea and Dry Grain Pulses Crisp Award for Meritorious Achievement, the Bean Improvement Cooperative's Meritorious and Distinguished Achievement Award, and the Gamma Sigma Delta Honor Society of Agriculture Distinguished Achievement in Agriculture. In 2016, Dr. Carlos received the distinction of having teaching auditorium named after him at the Escuela Agricola Panamericana with the apt dedication on the plaque stating, "In recognition of his exemplary and motivating work as a teacher and researcher, for his invaluable dedication to Zamorano University, and for his contributions to the welfare of the people of the Americas." Please join me in recognizing these two outstanding scientists. BIFAD is also pleased to announce that the Graduate Student Award goes to Mr. Louali Amadou from Niger. The focus of Mr. Amadou's work has been to develop scale-up culture procedures for beneficial parasitic insects that can be released to help control the millet head miner, a major chronic insect pest which can lead to an 85% reduction of crop yield for pearl millet, a main staple crop in the Sahel. Mr. Amadou has also evaluated when is the best time to release these beneficial insects that attack the millet head miner and the optimum number of parasitoids to be released. The growth and release of the beneficial biocontrol insects will help facilitate the establishment of a cottage industry to prevent and or limit damage of the millet head miner. Mr. Amadou and his colleagues have conducted a preliminary study to determine the economic viability of this approach. Pearl millet, as you know, yields were increased by 34% as compared to farms that did not use this technology. Mr. Amadou helped set up pilot studies with farmer groups in villages, individual smallholder farmers, and NGOs that work with farmers to evaluate the economic viability of the technology. Mr. Amadou's work clearly demonstrated the scalability of the technology. Economic benefits in Niger was estimated to be more than $200 million annually if only 30% of millet farmers use the technology. He's worked with a consortium of scientists from Burkina, from Mali, Niger, and Senegal on the biological control approach, helping spread the results regionally. Mr. Amadou is a PhD candidate at the University of Maradi in Niger, and is also a junior scientist at the Institute at INRA, Niger. He received his MS degree from the University of Niamey in Niger and his BS from Ahmadu Bello University of Zaria in Nigeria. He worked in the FEED, the Future Sorghum and Millet Innovation Lab, and he had a 6-month sandwich training at Virginia Tech University focused on insect behavior and ecology. it's easy to see how that intensive research training at Virginia Tech really made a difference in the development of this technology. Again, please join me in congratulating Ahmadou for this award.
Gabisa, thank you so much. And if you are like me, you really feel a sense of pride in seeing the accomplishments of your colleagues out there, and it has to spur you on, those of you that are engaged in research. But BIFAD has been so proud to be able to call attention to the outstanding scientific work of colleagues and particularly of young scientists like Mr. Ahmadou. And for those who are in the audience that I saluted a moment ago as LEAP Fellows, Borlaug LEAP Fellows, you have so many good role models to look at. And it's really worth reflecting on, because it takes the kind of dedication and excellence and preparation and delivery. So it's a wonderful thing, and Gabisa, thank you for calling our attention to these, and we'll look forward to the next official meeting when we will have them present for the award. It's my pleasure now to turn to an update on the global food security with Dr. Beth Dunford. All of you I know are very much aware of how USAID and certainly BIFAD and the university community generally felt so strongly that the Global Food Security Act was something that would be of value to us as we look to the future. And Beth Dunford was very involved in that, and she is assistant to the administrator for the Bureau of Food Security and the senior most leader in BFS right now. Dr. Dunford was USAID mission director in Nepal prior to this, where the Bureau of Food Security has a very large presence. She received her PhD degree from Michigan State University and has been a wonderful colleague to work with. Beth, we welcome you to the podium, wherever you'd like to stand in this case.
So I want to really thank Brady Deaton for his leadership and for all of the BIFAD for really your continued support and input to our efforts on global food security in Feed the Future. And I especially want to acknowledge and congratulate the World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Akin Adesina. Dr. Jetta really gave the span of his career and accomplishments, and we're just very proud as USAID to have been a partner and supporter of Dr. Adesina's since the very beginning, since Purdue and on through his career. So it's a very special moment for all of us, I think, as he has received this award this year. And I also really want to echo the congratulations on the recipients of the BIFAD Prize for Scientific Excellence in an Innovation Lab. A really impressive set of awardees, Dr. James Beaver and Dr. Juan Carlos Rosas, and of course, Mr. Luali Ahmadou. I'd like to really add my congratulations and sincere thanks as I continue to be excited by the research and outputs that our partners bring to bear on the efforts we're trying to achieve in global food security. So thank you for that. These achievements, I think, are critical to what we do, and really continuing to invest in research for development is critical to developing and taking to scale safe and effective technologies that address current challenges and also future challenges to come that affect the global population and food security. So at Feed the Future, as Brady was mentioning, the Global Food Security Act was passed in 2016, and again, that really codified into law efforts we have been undertaking after Feed the Future over quite some time, since 2010. And we have an approach that we think is really working, focusing on country ownership, partnerships, and investments in science and technology. So by working with our partners over many sectors, many of you are in the room, there'd be country governments, civil society, universities, private sector, Feed the Future is really delivering results. So since the start of the initiative, we've seen a 19% reduction in poverty in the areas where we work, and a 26% reduction in stunting, which is really demonstrating on-the-ground impact of our efforts in global food security. So there's been a lot achieved in the past 6 years, but actually, as we all know, there's a lot that needs to be done. This year, we're seeing more people than at any time since World War II are in need of emergency food assistance. It's at about 100 million right now. We also see that this is the first year that's reversing a decades-long trend of reducing the number of chronically food insecure people in the world. This year it's gone up. It's got up to 815 million. So there are urgent issues we need to address today, and it's really going in the wrong direction. So we really remain committed, partnering with all of you to advance our efforts around global food security. And again, as Brady mentioned, the Global Food Security Act was an important act for us, important ability for us to continue this work with strong bipartisan support. And as you all know, that's critically important right now when there aren't a lot of issues around which you have such bipartisan support. So we're really, really proud to have that going forward. Our array of partners that I mentioned earlier. Also really want to mention our interagency colleagues. Feed the Future is comprised of 11 U.S. government agencies. I see colleagues here from MCC, USDA. I know colleagues from State Department and Peace Corps will also be at this gathering. So again, we all bring our different resources and tools to bear where together we can have a greater impact on our efforts around global food security. So, but given the problems that are facing us today and recognizing this is with a world of 7.5 billion people and recognizing that we look towards a world where there will be 10 billion people, how will we safely and effectively nourish these people? I think it's how do we boost food production without degrading dwindling supplies of arable land, fresh water, other resources, and do it in an inclusive manner. So in a world where pests and diseases can easily cross borders and persistent hunger abroad can have geopolitical consequences at home, finding new and innovative ways to promote global food security is critical to the progress we need for a more prosperous and stable future. I think we're going to hear a lot of talk during the next couple of days around fall armyworm, which is one of these pests that is crossing borders and really causing a grave threat to food security on the African continent right now. Again, this is one of many, many issues confronting our work on global food security. And we know in all of this, the higher education community is a critical and important partner for developing these innovative solutions to food insecurity and the agricultural challenges that benefit farmers around the world. And we're seeing actually our investments in research abroad actually come home and protect the livelihoods of farmers back here in the U.S. And that's through our 24 innovation labs, which involve over 70 university partners here in the United States. And we're really proud of that partnership and that investment. And mostly, I'm excited about the innovation that our U.S. universities and other research partners bring to bear on achieving sustainable reductions in poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. And I think, as many of you know, the U.S. government's Global Food Security Research Strategy, which was developed to support the goals of the Global Food Security Strategy, was launched at the BIFAD meeting last month. So we're really excited about that, really taking the great research that's been done in ever more promising directions, focusing on broad themes of advancing productivity, reducing and managing risk, and improving knowledge of how to achieve human outcomes in economic opportunity, nutrition, and resilience. So we're confident that going forward, research outputs from our new strategy will continue to drive global improvements in food security and protect, again, against tomorrow's food security risks at home and also abroad. So I'd really like to thank the BIFAD for taking up a topic that's very, very important to us as we see recurrent shocks become ever more frequent in areas where we work, and to really focus today's discussion around resilience. The U.S. government's Global Food Security Strategy, as I discussed last year, really elevated resilience to one of its three top objectives to make sure that we're focused on it in the way we need to throughout our entire programming, including our research. So our investments on resilience are already paying clear dividends in places like Kenya, places like Ethiopia, where they align and support country-led investment, which is very, very critical to the success of these initiatives going forward. So as humanitarian assistance reaches an all-time high, efforts to provide life-saving assistance are strained. And Greg Collins, our director for our Center for Resilience, will tell you much more about this soon. But he'll highlight that an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. And so proactive responses can save lives, livelihoods, money, and can really protect hard-fought gains in the areas of food security and economic growth. And so I think that these proactive responses coupled with long-term development investments, I was able to see that when I was out in Ethiopia with the administrator in August, and we saw that households in Ethiopia's lowlands during the 2016 El Nino drought were able to maintain their food security status through what was a very, very big shock. It was a 50-year event, El Nino, in the lowlands of Ethiopia. And as they maintained their food security status with a comprehensive set of resilience interventions, households and communities outside of those areas that did not receive those same interventions saw a precipitous 30% decline in their food security status. So that's proof that it works, and we're looking to work with you all to see how we can scale this up and become more innovative as we move forward. So we've shown that progress is possible, and we also think that it's very important for America to be involved in this, showing its intellectual leadership, and also some of the gains we have can also come back to help us here at home. We couldn't do this without the contributions of the U.S. higher education community. I really want to appreciate your partnership and your thought leadership on this going forward. So thank you very much.
We're going to take it. Beth, thank you very much. That was inspiring, really, and appreciate it. We're going to take a few minutes for Q&A, and I'm going to turn to my BIFAD colleagues for questions, the audience here for questions, and Samantha, if any questions come in over the transom, so to speak, we will take those. So you can let us know. And Kristen Franklin will have a microphone for anyone in the audience who would like to ask questions. So Beth, thank you for being with us and for that update and very, very fascinating presentation. Any questions from any of my colleagues here? Harold, including you.
Thank you.
Beth, one of the, I think we've talked about this before.
I've called them.
Hallway. Thank you. We've talked about this before, that just the incredible excitement and really getting traction on a way forward, having now these 3 pillars on productivity, health, and resilience. One of the things that we want to talk about is, what are we doing to make sure that we're also getting cross-linkage amongst those areas, and that what we're not creating with the new strategy is 3 new silos of endeavor?
So I think that's an excellent question, because the 3 objectives of our new strategy are inclusive ag-led growth, the productivity piece, resilience, and nutrition. And all of them are very interlinked, particularly resilience. I think that resilience, as much as anything, is really a way of thinking about the work that we do in certain areas. And I think that's incumbent upon us to make sure that our productivity efforts are really focusing on how can we make sure that they are nutrition sensitive, that we're working on crops that can also be beneficial to our nutrition efforts. How can we do that in a way that really engages the resilience agenda? So I think it's incumbent on us to set ourselves up so we do that, to make sure that in everything that we do, if we're more productivity based, that we think about how does this also link into the other 2 objectives.
Do we have any shared metrics across the 3 within the measurement framework?
So the indicators right now are just being finalized, and I would say that the indicators definitely go objective by objectives, but again, each entity will be reporting on the 3 top-line objectives, and some of them are shared between a couple of them, nutrition and resilience and productivity. And I think that's something that we can continue to work on as we refine our metrics going forward. Yep.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience here? Or Samantha, any from outside?
Not yet.
Okay. I want to thank you, Beth, and USAID.
Seems like there's one right there.
Oh, sorry. I missed one.
We need a
Director
microphone.
of IIT.
Yeah, thank you. Sanginga with IITA. Interesting, you have those three pillars. It would be good to have an idea, how do you link that to security? And especially in Africa, in some zones like the Somalian zone or the Sahelian zone, where the problem of resilience are real, and that's where you see a lot of security problem, but that's where we see also immigration, or I would say immigration.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you link those, and do you hypothesize that in basically solving the problem of the interaction between productivity, nutrition, and stability, you will be able probably to reduce some of the issue of security?
So I think that's a very important question. I think that there is a relationship between security, so conflict and food security. I think you're talking about security in the terms of conflict, yeah? So there's a relationship between food security and conflict. We know that in places like, let's say, northeastern Nigeria, one of the biggest recruitment tools of Boko Haram is really providing access to financial services. And these are people in rural areas, youths in rural areas who rely on agriculture and livestock production for their livelihoods. And so there is a relationship between the two. I mean, there are examples after examples, starting from World War II, starting way back behind that, about the relationship between food and conflict. Again, it's a complex one, and there are other issues that are really outside the food security world, but there is a relationship there, and we think that by providing broader opportunities that we can positively impact security in that way. Also, the other part of your question was around, can you remind me? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So, I mean, Greg is going to go into this. Excuse me? Immigration. So immigration is one tool, one livelihood opportunity, one livelihood path that does provide sometimes an important source of income for people. And I think that it's working on making sure that people have different options that provide them with an ability to have inclusive economic growth. And so I think that providing better food security at home can help stem the flow of migration, but I think migration does often offer an important source of livelihoods. And I think that's something that Greg will talk about more during the resilience session, because migration is very critical to the resilience agenda.
Yes, question?
Hi, I'm Harley Stokes with Catholic Relief Services. I was wondering how food loss is integrated when we're thinking about agricultural productivity, because it feels like a lot of the conversation is how do we create more, rather than how do we preserve what's already being created and lost.
So I think that's an important question. We do focus very heavily on post-harvest losses. I think one example is the PICS bag that came out of Purdue University, the example of a low-cost, innovative technology that's really game-changing, enabling farmers to store grain in a safe and protected way to minimize or eliminate loss. And these bags, after being developed, are now really starting to show up in markets in most of the countries where we work. So I think that's the kind of technology that we're working on in post-harvest loss. But anyway, there are many, many others, and it's an important part of what we do. So thank you for raising that important element.
My name is Anthony from Texas Tech. Now, in terms of food security, an issue that has come up is about the double burden of malnutrition. Even in some of these countries where we have undernutrition, there's evidence that people are becoming more obese, and it's being a more of a healthy issue. So BIFAD, are you doing something with regard to that aspect of food insecurity?
So thank you. Important question. Our focus is more on undernutrition and is specifically targeting the first 1,000 days of a child's life from pregnancy to 2 years old. There is a relationship. You often see undernourishment turn into overnourishment later in life. And so I think that given the magnitude of the problem on both sides, as you were saying, our focus in impoverished areas is really getting adequate and the right nutrition to children during those first 1,000 days, where we think we can make the most difference.
Yes. A couple more questions. Kristen in the middle here.
Yeah, well, I was quite curious with your response. I was not satisfied.
Oh.
And the reason is there are two. Most of the time, it's really, obviously, we respond that way without any measurement and without even any research on exactly how you link those three pillars to the issue of security, call it Boko Haram and so on. It would be very good to start having some good hypotheses and trying to measure and having some indicator really to be able to respond to that is really happening. Secondly, how within USAID, how do you talk to your colleagues who are dealing with those issues of security? Do you interact with them? Do you have some common program? That would be interesting to know.
Great. So I think you're going to get into this more in the second session. I think that we are working in areas, we do interact with our colleagues who work on conflict on a daily basis. We feel like this is part of what we do, is to move our programs into areas where we can operate in and around conflict to really provide safe alternative livelihood options. And so there is that linkage, and we are moving in that direction, and I think Greg can give you a more full explanation of how we're doing that. And on the question of measurement, I think that there's a whole suite of indicators that we're using to measure the three pillars. I think they're out for public comment right now, or that comment period has just closed. But our top line indicators are poverty, levels of poverty, levels of hunger, and levels of malnutrition, focusing on stunting. And so that's where it all comes together, and that's the top line goals of what we're after in the initiative. I think there was a question right next to it.
One more question here. This will be our last question. Till later.
Hello, my name is Carrie Lajeunesse, and I'm with Lejeune Consulting. This is really exciting, and this may be a question that would be better for Greg later, but I'll ask it now just in case. So is USAID been involved with the new initiative, the NWOW, New Way of Working initiative, where they're looking at coordination between humanitarian assistance, development, and the peace-building sectors in this way of building resilience?
So I'm going to leave that for Greg to address during his session, but yeah? Okay, Greg is going to address that during his session.
Okay, Beth, we're going, let me thank you again. I think this has really piqued a lot of our interest and pointed to the future. It's important that the university community, the NGO community, the aid community in this country and elsewhere recognize the kind of interfaces that we have been talking about here. And you really hit some very, very key points. And 100 million in need of food assistance today, at the same time that we feel we've made real progress. No question we have made real progress in enabling so many people to become more self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. So that's the challenge. A lot of people are excited about what they can do, utilizing their backgrounds and skills to address these issues. And we're going to be hearing a great deal more about this just in the next few minutes. At this point, Beth, with great thanks to you again, we're going to take a short break and basically re-gear with a panel discussion that will be led by Greg Collins. His name keeps coming up, and all the answers are being, or all the questions are being thrown your way, Greg. So we'll take a short break. You can say hello to everybody, but we will start back at 2 o'clock sharp. So be back in your seats at 2 o'clock sharp. Thank you so much.
Last year we didn't work out very well when we had a break.
I was worried about that too. Almost just avoided it. I should try to. Yes.
Yeah, there is one.
Greg, I will take a moment to introduce you when we start back. And,
Great. I think we'll have the panelists up here
Yeah.
already, so I'll just stand next to you or sit next to you.
yeah, or if you want to let me
Yeah, that'd be great.
get out of your way. Then. Well, that was a rousing start.
Yeah, a lot of stuff well. The audience actually says it. People ask me it's very good.
Actually, I'm going to stay up just to keep the crowd. You ready? Moving to
I guess. As much as I can be.
Hey, piece of cake. You've never had any trouble talking to me.
Yeah, I hope that continues to be the case.
It's
No,
a
I
long
just
session, so if you want a bathroom break, might be advised.
water
Actually,
maybe.
yeah, water would be good.
Yes, I am. Hi. Nice to meet you.
They do seem to.
I am. Alamine.
Why am I having? I mean, something wrong.
Just remember Mayu. Ala.
Mayu. Mayu.
That's actually where the word comes from. Ala.
Yeah,
Mayu.
I guess my memory is like.
Remember it going?
Yeah, my memory's going. I think I cooked too many brain cells last night.
We're probably just in the way anyway.
that happen?
No, it usually gets back to me. So just remember, you might not feel like you're ready, but you're now going to be. You could be worrying about having your heart out right now.
No, please. I tell you, the older we get, your risk perception change. You know, it becomes more realistic.
No matter what you think, there's always somebody that's worse off than you.
How's that?
Just worried about Mark. Yes, we have more than enough time, especially this week. We have plenty to say.
I thought it was going to stay. Start to open up a bit. That's good.
What's that? Oh, thank you.
Do you have any whiskey?
By the way, we're live. Yeah.
Excuse me. Someone mentioned I should say something about so you can ask questions. Is that how this is being measured? You can send an email, use Twitter, or yeah, someone said they could. Right, the way this is being measured. I've seen it. It's economy.
Well, and the next thing we have to do
Try and keep us similar.
I guess apparently we're live.
You can't turn this off. What were we on? What were we like before? Get ready. I think we should all be wearing sunglasses.
What's that?
Hats.
What's that?
We should all be wearing sunglasses.
I'm going to see them. Yeah. I'm just watch myself. It's kind of neat. What's that?
Seems like a new man up there. Did you see how like concise Tim was in his presentations up in DC?
Yeah.
I was like, that's amazing. I mean, you've like trimmed your whole talking voice down to like under time.
Maybe I should slow down.
I don't know. I mean,
There's plenty of time.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is that just more like Tiffany's insistence, or you sort of like you're getting some professional lessons?
Hey, they can hear me.
Anyway, no.
I wonder if Tiffany's listening.
get everybody lined up here. Well, I hate to break up wonderful conversation, but I would ask that... Deaf ears back there. Can you hear me in the back? Gabisa. Who's back there? We're going to need to get started with the...
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The meeting will resume momentarily.
You know, the program got off to such a great start. And got everybody
Ladies and
inspired.
gentlemen, please take your seats. The meeting will begin momentarily.
While everyone's getting their seat, let me just make a couple of introductions before we move to the panel. I know there are so many distinguished people in the room, but I did want to call attention to a couple that are with us this morning. One is Melanie Vance. Melanie, raise your hand. Thank you for being with us. Chief of Staff of the Bureau of Food Security. And we also have Pat Shake with Food and Agricultural Service. Pat, thank you for being here. She reminded me to emphasize, as we usually do in these sessions, the critical role that the private sector plays, the private business sector as well as the NGO sector, in working with universities, with USAID, and the global alliance of other countries, other donor communities, and the vibrant entrepreneurial collective action communities within the countries that we're working with. And some questions have arisen already that point in that direction. But to make these issues sustainable, to make the problems be resolved on an ongoing basis, it's going to take the actors from across that spectrum to do that job. And we're going to hear a great deal in depth here at this session, and my role is to simply introduce Greg Collins, the director of USAID's Center for Resilience, and he also serves as the agency's resilience coordinator, and he will then introduce the rest of the panel. But I just wanted to point out that Greg has really become quite a thought leader worldwide in emphasis on resilience and the multifaceted way in which various contributors bring to resolving some of the most difficult development issues that we face. He received his PhD in economic sociology from the University of California, Davis, and did some incredibly fascinating work on the private sector in Somalia at that time. But he's worked with drought and emergency situations across Africa over the last several years of his career, and has the kind of background in technical and organizational acumen that can lead to the emphasis that we now see in USAID, and which I know will be embraced by so many in the community that is here with us today, here in the room and online. So Greg, thank you for the role you're playing, for your leadership in USAID, and for operationalizing what clearly is a very exciting next step in development.
Great. Thank you, Brady. Okay, thank you, Brady. Thank you, the rest of the BIFAD members. It's a real pleasure to be here today. We have had a lot of attention around resilience in 2011-2012, following large-scale drought emergencies in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. And, you know, a lot of us who got involved back then weren't sure it was going to stick. It's clearly stuck. I think a big reason it's stuck is the evidence base that's growing around resilience. USAID and some of our partners held a resilience evidence forum a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., where we consolidated some of that evidence, and we'll be highlighting that in a panel discussion here. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists and then give a framing of resilience within USAID, within the global food security strategy, take on some of the thorny issues that were raised in the first session that at best so graciously passed to the second session. But before I do that, a couple of things. First, just a reminder for those joining online, you can ask questions on Twitter. You can also email questions to the email address on your screen. And then you can also ask questions in the comment screen on the AgriLinks live stream. Now to our panelists. First, we also have a missing panelist, Dr. Mark Constas from the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. We were super excited to have him as part of this panel. Unfortunately, he's had a health issue come up that precludes him from attending here. But he is part of a core group driving resilience measurement globally. He leads something called the Technical Working Group on Resilience Measurement that brings together key donors, UN agency, NGOs to lead on developing a measurement approach that Tim Frankenberger will be speaking to today. But just also our thoughts are with Mark as he's facing a health challenge. I know he really wanted to be here. In terms of who we have on the panel, we have John Kurtz to my left. He is Mercy Corps' Director for Research and Learning. He leads the agency's program research and impact evaluation efforts. Prior to that, he worked with other international NGOs, UN agencies, to improve their ability to generate and use high-quality evidence for program effectiveness. His recent research examined the effects of employment creation on the risk of political violence among youth in Afghanistan, Somalia, Kenya. So perhaps may be well positioned to help with a question raised in the first round. And also analyze the links between conflict management and livelihood resilience among agro-pastoralists in the Horn of Africa. He has an MSc in Management of Agricultural Knowledge Systems from how do I pronounce it? Wageningen? There you go. I should work on my Dutch. Next to John, we have Tim Frankenberger. He's the president and co-founder of Tango International and a global expert on food security, livelihood approaches, and resilience. I'd add to that resilience measurement. Tim has over 35 years of experience in international development with specialized skills in project design, M&E, policy analysis. He previously served as the Senior Food Security Advisor and Livelihood Security Coordinator at CARE and a Farming Systems Research Specialist at the University of Arizona. Tim has published numerous articles on household food security and resilience. His current research interests include resilience measurement in food insecure contexts, something we'll be focused on today, and appropriate mechanisms for social protection. Last but not at all least, we have Dr. Nancy Mock from Tulane University. She's an international development professional with nearly 40 years of professional experience in more than 30 countries. I can't believe these people are claiming this, these years in the industry. She established a number of programs within and outside Tulane University in the areas of disaster resilience leadership studies, food security and nutrition, international health, and post-Katrina recovery. For the sake of transparency, I was also a student of Nancy's when I did my MPH at Tulane. She's also a member of the Interagency Technical Working Group on Resilience Measurement and has designed and mentored major innovative initiatives in early warning, monitoring, and evaluation, including the Famine Early Warning System, which we all now know as FuseNet, and the Standardized Monitoring and Assessment of Relief Transitions, SMART. She's also developed, and I think it will be of particular interest to this group, numerous higher education partnership models and networks in service of development objectives, including resilience, and Nancy will be speaking to that. So a big welcome to our panel, who will have to sit here and watch me give a presentation they've definitely seen before. Round of applause, please. So let me get started. A few key takeaways up front. Beth mentioned this, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We actually have some statistics around this. A study in 2013 by BIFAD, and a woman named Courtney Cabot-Venton estimates that every dollar invested in resilience over the long term, and we're talking about a 20-year period here, will result in $2.9 in reduced humanitarian assistance, avoided losses, and improved well-being. We've also done some research with the Overseas Development Institute, looking at the broader relevance of resilience to enabling sustainable poverty escapes. The research, which I'll get into a little bit in this talk, looks at the rate at which people escape poverty only to fall back into poverty, and that rate is alarming. Nationally in Ethiopia, between 1999 and 2009, 63% of the households that escaped poverty fell back into poverty. Rural Kenya, about 44%. Even throughout Asia, 20-25% depending on country. The way that ODI puts it, poverty escapes are not a one-way street. I'll be talking to that a bit. The second point, and I think it was well raised in relation to the private sector here, is the role of donors in helping share and shift responsibility to governments, communities, and the private sector by making smart investments that actually build their capacity to take a lead role not only in responding to droughts when they do occur, but investing in resilience and managing risk. Finally, Pam seemed to like this particular phrase, but a key takeaway I hope you'll take from this presentation is what we call systems thinking in an earmarked world. I think you're all aware that the way USAID is organized and the way that Congress determines our funding streams, we've got HIV/AIDS money, we've got food security money, we've got conflict money. And in a lot of cases, if that money's not going to different countries, it's going to different parts of the same country. And that makes a coordination challenge extremely difficult. We've been able to use some of the motivating analytics behind our resilience agenda to begin to bridge some of those gaps. A lot of us thought the big bridge was going to be how do we get the humanitarian side to work with the development side. The reality is it was just as hard to get the health side to work with the food security side, to work with the education side, but we've really made some progress, and I'll talk to why in a few minutes. There's also a series of sources of resilience, as we've been looking at this from a measurement and analytics standpoint, that transcend sectors, and this is incredibly important. This is things like social capital, the ability to lean on other households, women's empowerment, aspiration. Nancy's going to be talking to this a bit on the panel, but what's critical there is it's forcing development actors, both donor-funded and governments, to begin to get out of these technical sectors and realize that, yes, technical sectors are important, but there's a number of important sources of resilience that transcend sectors, and we're beginning to get an evidence base around what those are. So let's start with a definition. This is a fairly straightforward and I think intuitive one. Resilience is the ability to manage adversity and change without compromising future well-being. If you know USAID or any large bureaucracy, we don't end up with definitions like that. We end up with definitions like these. USAID defines resilience as the ability of people, households, communities, and countries and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. A mouthful to be sure, but this overspecification is actually incredibly important when we get to how we measure resilience. Back in 2011, 2012, there was a lot of arguments about what's the best proxy outcome for resilience? Is it malnutrition? Is it food security? Is it hunger? Is it education? We've over the years evolved the approach to resilience measurement to say resilience actually is not an outcome. It's an ability that's enabled by a set of capacities. Those set of capacities exist at different scales, and those capacities are realized in relation to shocks and stresses. Yes, major things like droughts or floods, but also the idiosyncratic shocks, such as health shocks within a household, the loss of a wage earner that really eke away at a household's ability to manage risk. If you go to northeastern Kenya and you ask a household, what's the biggest threat to your livelihood? Few people would say drought. Most people would say loss of a wage earner, a health crisis within my household. So it's incredibly important to remember that these large covariate shocks like drought are exposing moments for a much more complex set of shocks and stresses that are interacting with one another and creating vulnerability. So what's the cost of recurrent crisis? So here is a graph, which should probably be updated now that I look at it. Recurrent humanitarian responses in northern Kenya dating back to 2000. So the real cost when we look at this, and I'm not just talking dollar costs, loss of lives and livelihoods and loss of aspiration. I think a motivating analytic it's a little hard to talk about at times is that we need to always remind ourselves 250,000 people died in Somalia in 2011. Half of those were children under 5. So that's got to be part of the motivating analytics here that drive us to make these investments. A loss of livelihoods and aspiration as well. Also losses to national and regional economies, and this is a real motivating analytic for governments. The government of Kenya did a study and looked at the impact of unfettered drought on the economy between 2008 and 2011, and it's estimated that $12.1 billion in losses to the Kenyan economy. That really engendered a change in how the government thought about drought risk in northern Kenya. not just something that donors respond to, but something they needed to own and deal with. And I'll talk a little bit about the change in Kenya that's come as a result of that. Finally, the cost of recurrent U.S. government humanitarian spending. It's not just U.S. government, it's humanitarian spending by a broad set of actors. Who can tell me how much the U.S. government spent responding to drought in the Horn of Africa in 2011? Somebody hazard a guess.
10 billion.
Not 10 billion. $1 billion in 2011, but that's 2011 alone. Another 500 million in the Sahel the same year. If we look at an individual country like Ethiopia, and we've gone back and looked at the data just on U.S. government humanitarian spending, it's absolutely astronomical. About $3 billion spent in Ethiopia by the U.S. government alone over the last 10 years, and that's prior to the current year. And so these are unsustainable, clearly. As Beth mentioned, humanitarian assistance needs around the globe are at an all-time high. That's not all about droughts and floods and health shocks and health crisis. A great deal of those are man-made, so there's been a shift in the nature of maybe not recurrent crisis, but protracted crisis that I'll talk to as well. But the idea here is we cannot afford to not invest in the resilience of people, households, communities, systems, and countries, because the cost of not doing so in these three senses is unsustainable. So where are we really looking at this building resilience to recurrent crisis? In terms of the global food security strategy, I've highlighted here in red the countries where we have a zone within that country that's subject to recurrent crisis, where we go back every 3 to 5 years and respond with humanitarian assistance. So that's northeastern Kenya, the vulnerable highlands and lowlands of Ethiopia, Karamoja in Uganda, Somalia, northeastern Nigeria is a protracted crisis, Niger, Mali, northern Mopti moving into Timbuktu, Malawi, particularly in the south, and Haiti. The ones in red are global food security strategy target countries. But even beyond these areas of recurrent crisis, there's a cost to vulnerability or a cost to a lack of resilience. I mentioned the work with the Overseas Development Institute. Here's some of the statistics around that. In terms of the gray bar is the rate at which households move out of poverty only to fall back into poverty over a defined period of time. We also went back to households that fell back into poverty and tried to understand why that household fell back into poverty. It is never a single shock event. It's a series of shocks and stresses that unfold over a lifetime that really speak to the compound and complex nature of risk. So a lot of times when I talk about resilience, people say this sounds like integrated rural development. This sounds like old wine in new bottles. We've definitely heard that one before. I do think it's important to recognize that everything we do through development, or our good development investments, and everything done through humanitarian recovery and rehabilitation programs does contribute to the resilience of the households and community with which we're working. So I want to point out some things that are different about this approach that was really born out of the 2011-2012 drought emergency in the Horn. The first is a developmental focus on people and places subject to recurrent crisis. I think most people in the room could think of a country that they've worked in where there's a certain part of the country, and that's where we respond to emergencies. That's not where we do development. The conditions aren't in place for us to do development, be they infrastructure, governance, etc. This flips that logic on its head and says we actually can't afford not to for the costs I outlined earlier. Within the global food security strategy, there's also this recognition about the broader relevance of resilience in relation to sustainable poverty escapes. A second difference is that shocks and stresses are recognized as perennial features, not anomalies. How many people in this room have been in a design workshop? You get to the assumption column and you say no major drought will occur during the project implementation cycle. I'd actually like to see a show of hands. I saw Pam. All too often, this assumption that a shock's not going to occur is inconsistent with the evidence. We know it's going to happen. And when you flip that on its head and you say the assumption is a significant shock event is going to occur while we're implementing our programs, it reshifts the nature of investment so that we, in addition to investing in facilitating inclusive growth, we're investing in reducing and managing complex risk, investing in adaptation to change. We're also ensuring that our investments on the ground are shock responsive. The most sort of prominent or largest scale would be safety net programs designed to respond when a shock occurs to provide assistance to additional households. So that's a key what's different. A third within USAID, certainly, but I think an increasing number of actors, is this joint analysis, planning, and implementation, or what I called earlier, systems thinking in an earmarked world, sequencing, layering, in integrating our investments across the humanitarian development sphere. These categories won't mean much to some of you, but this is the number of funding streams that we have going into an integrated set of investments in northern Kenya. 11 different funding streams ranging from PEPFAR, our HIV/AIDS funding, to conflict, to governance, to food security, to education, and frankly, it didn't start out with this many, but it's attracted additional funding as people began to realize we've got a stake in resilience from our sectoral standpoint because we can't achieve and sustain our particular sectoral outcome without building the set of capacities these people are calling resilience. By the same token, the evidence is also clear that we cannot build this set of capacities, these resilience capacities, through single sector intervention. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later today. Quickly, some program areas of investment, and these are very broad. Expanding economic opportunities on and off farm, in and outside of agriculture, and we'll speak a little bit to migration on this panel. Diversifying livelihood opportunities and risk. Financial services, as we've looked empirically at what predicts whether a household is going to be able to manage through shock events. Access to savings, credits, remittances, insurance seems to be an important source of resilience across contexts. But also strengthening governance and local institutions. Again, broadly conceived to include natural resource management, conflict management, disaster risk management, and early response when shocks do occur. I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to just a couple country examples. And then finally, a pillar around improving health and human capital, including health systems, nutrition, but also literacy, education, and workforce development. So I mentioned these sources of resilience that transcends technical sectors as well. I won't get much into it here because Nancy's going to speak to it. These may be more about how we program than what technical sectors we're programming in, and we'll take that up as part of the panel. This is just a graphic looking at diversifying livelihood risk, and I think that one of the interesting things about the global food security strategy, it really recognized the heterogeneity of pathways out of poverty, or sustainable pathways out of poverty, that are taking place in the communities with which we work. An awful lot of households are stepping up within agriculture, improving production, post-harvest loss, also stepping up within agricultural value chains, as traders, as aggregators, as service providers. But an awful lot of households are also having to step a foot out of agriculture or move entirely out. This is determined in part by people's asset base, by their resources, by strategies available to them, defined by a variety of things, be it caste, gender, etc. It's also defined by aspiration, what people want to do, and that's a really interesting question when it comes to youth. And then, of course, we have a significant number of people hanging in and dropping out. And one of the things that was mentioned earlier by Beth is migration, which gets a sort of a particular label. For our EU colleagues, that label is migration to Europe. But it's the varieties of migration to rural hubs, to towns, to secondary cities, to capital cities, and the role that plays when a shock hits, something like a drought, and a household has one of their household members in a Garissa town in northeastern Kenya, and that household member is able to remit money back during a shock event. So we'll talk about this on that panel. Just a few country examples, and these are text-heavy. I won't certainly read through all of it, but what I do want to point out here, this is really about getting behind country-led efforts. And in Kenya, there's something called the Ending Drought Emergencies Initiative. Now, a lot of countries put forward these initiatives. What's interesting about Kenya is they've actually committed $1.6 billion against this initiative over 5 years. That's matched by about $1.5 billion from donors, including about $300 million from USAID. So we're an important player. We are not the scale agent here. And I think that's important. When we look at the types of investments we've made, I think most people here are familiar with index-based livestock insurance, a very targeted small-scale investment to prove an innovation. What was amazing about the index-based livestock insurance in Kenya is that the government scaled that program up through something called the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program, and it's now paying out millions to vulnerable pastoralists in the face of the current drought. So there's a quick hit from research, the partnership, public-private partnership between the government and the Kenyan private sector to scale a risk management tool, and the donor's role was some targeted money on research improving the innovation. So I think that's a nice example of the role we can play as donors in this. We have done a lot to expand economic opportunities in our own right, strengthen governance, and improve human capital. But really, it's Kenya's forward-leaniness in terms of their drought cycle management investments, not only the index-based livestock insurance, but setting up county-level contingency plans that are paying out right now as well. Earlier, they had been part of something called the African Risk Capacity, which is actually an insurance program through the African Union that allows countries to purchase insurance to insure their own humanitarian assistance liabilities. It has worked reasonably well in some countries. Kenya had made a decision, unfortunately, in 2016 to step out of that program. The other accelerator in Kenya is devolution. And if you ever wondered why governance matters as part of this, when decision-making and resources were devolved to counties in Kenya, a remarkable thing happened. The northern arid land counties, which had been not long neglected under previous presidencies, because they had determined the county-level allocation in part by poverty prevalence, a place like Turkana in the northwest of the country, highest poverty prevalence by far, received the second largest county-level budget, only behind Nairobi County. So we had resources from government to help accelerate this at a local level. We also had governments who were from these places who were truly held responsible by their constituencies to delivering on a new vision for northern Kenya. So that's been an important accelerator. In Ethiopia, we've also seen significant progress on poverty and malnutrition in terms of the particular contribution of programs like the Productive Safety Net program, a program that covers about 8 million people, a Government of Ethiopia program. It's reduced the food gap, distressed sales and assets, helped move 1.5 people out of poverty. That progress was definitely tested in the 2016 El Nino drought and is also being tested in a significant drought in the lowlands today. Again, USAID played a critical role. Our investments in expanding economic opportunities help attract 15 million in private sector investment into abattoirs in the Somali region that are really going to be an engine of the livestock economy. We also, in the vulnerable highlands of Ethiopia, tested a program called Graduation, or GRAD, that was layered in on top of the Productive Safety Net program with the intent of showing how you could expand economic opportunities and actually enable households to move off the safety net program, make that proactive choice. There was an opportunity cost to being in the safety net program in terms of public works, that there was enough opportunity beyond that that they could take advantage of. Now, GRAD increased incomes among 33,000 households by $373 per year, and that's an incredible achievement. Within the context of Ethiopia, 33,000 households is a drop in the bucket. The biggest contribution of the FTF Feed the Future graduation program in Ethiopia is that the government of Ethiopia built the livelihood activities from that program into its 8 million person productive safety net program in its phase 4. So again, testing innovation, showing what's possible, recognizing that government, private sector are the scale agents. And I think I've covered most of that here. Now, does all of this work? Does all of this actually build resilience? Beth had mentioned this in her opening comments. Yes, we do have evidence it works. We also are very clear that these types of efforts that comprehensively address across different pillars of investment need to be scaled. Now, what is this evidence? Tim's going to talk to it a little bit when we get to the panel. But during 2016, the El Nino drought in the lowlands of Ethiopia, we had a drought-triggered monitoring system that began collecting data every 2 months as the drought unfolded, once a certain threshold was crossed. What this evidence showed is that households experiencing the severest drought conditions, the sort of far end of the graph, where we had invested significant resilience programs, were by and large able to manage through the drought with only a minor decline in their food security status, about 4%. By contrast, households in other communities experienced this precipitous decline of 30% that Beth had mentioned. So powerful evidence that these investments work, but clearly by the numbers we're seeing globally and even in Ethiopia, things need to be scaled up. So I've already covered that. The other thing about these resilience portfolios, because they're targeting areas that are subject to recurrent crisis, they provide a platform for an integrated response to drought. So in 2016, we didn't just respond with humanitarian assistance, we actually adjusted some of our development programs. One example is we provided loans to livestock traders to facilitate commercial destocking and begin to get the very markets that we were investing in to be part of the response. We also provided grants to fodder providers. What was also fundamentally different about 2016 in Ethiopia was the government's response. I already mentioned the expansion of the Productive Safety Net program to reach an additional 2 million people. That wasn't done in an ad hoc manner. There was a risk financing element to the Productive Safety Net program. It costs about a third to provide a humanitarian assistance to people through the safety net program than it does by standing up a standalone humanitarian assistance program. Also, the government of Ethiopia led the humanitarian response with a response of about $735 million in responding to the drought. That is fundamentally different than the government's response in the past. So when we talk about sharing responsibility, shifting responsibility, this is good evidence of that, but a long way to go for sure. These are some sources of resilience in the face of drought in 2015. So when we look at the data, what explains why some households fare better in the face of the drought? Again, things I've already mentioned, financial services, informal safety nets and social capital, access to markets, access to natural resources. This varies by location, but the point here is we can actually measure and tease out what are the particular sources of resilience that matter in this context at this time. And there are some that transcend context, social capital and financial services being high among them. Then our colleague who raised the issue in the first panel, we are very aware of the frontier issue around the relationship between these investments and fragility, conflict, and even violent extremism. And why are we confronting this? In 2010, a third of the world's extreme poor lived in fragile states. Today, it's 1/2. By 2030, it's projected to be 2/3. That should be motivating all of us to think about what needs to be different when we're investing in fragile areas. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, been a significant increase in protracted man-made humanitarian crises. Famines in Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, northeastern Nigeria have a driver in man-made conflict. Also, answering the colleague's question from earlier, there is a geographic coincidence of recurrent crisis and violent extremism in Africa. If we look at where we're programming to build resilience, in Mali, northern Mopti moving into Timbuktu. In Burkina Faso, in the northern part of the country moving into the Sahel. In Nigeria, northeastern Nigeria. In Kenya, northern Kenya, including the bordering Somalia corridor, Garissa, Wajir, Mandera. In Somalia, in select areas where we're able to because of security reasons. It's not happenstance that areas of recurrent crisis are also areas that extremist groups can thrive. And part of the reason is that the violent extremist groups can exploit recruitment, certain conditions that exist. A lack of economic opportunities. There was a study by UNDP that was released about 3 weeks ago. It's called Journey to Violent Extremism in Africa. And it estimates about 55% of voluntary recruits to extremist organizations cited lack of employment as a primary concern at time of joining. So there is something here. I don't think any of us have the solutions. I do think more research is needed. But I don't think we can turn our heads from the fact that there is a role for these types of investments in resilience, in food security, in expanding economic opportunities, and helping get at some of the push factors. They're not total solutions unto themselves, but they are important push factors. So I'm going to end it there, and we're going to maybe pause for a few questions before we shift into a panel discussion. So I can open it up to questions there, Brady.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. My name is Jane. I'm coming from Kenya Agricultural Research Organization. My question is, I'm very happy that you're looking more into the northern Kenya, and various good things are happening. And I'm very glad also to hear that devolution has helped in making sure that your programs are succeeding. My question is, what are considering the ground situation in northern Kenya, what are your priority crops that you're looking into for the future of northern Kenya? Considering that the other part of Kenya grows mainly corn, which has really been hit by the maize lethal necrosis disease, and we have few farmers growing rice. Thank you.
Great. I think there are some opportunities for dryland farming, and I think actually the World Food Program has done some pretty incredible stuff through their Food for Assets investments in places like Turkana, Marsabit, Wajir, where they are creating opportunities. The reality of the arid lands, though, is the primary driver of that economy is going to be livestock. And I think making investments in livestock, recognizing that some people are stepping out of that, we do see that, when someone steps out of I don't think there was ever a pure pastoralism, but when people make the choice to send a kid to school so that that kid can go to Garissa town and engage in petty trade, and then something happens with the livestock investments, they have a sort of safety net. I also think the migration question is interesting, not only for the drylands of Kenya, but in addition to diversifying livelihood risk, it's also providing a source of capital for investment, including in agriculture. Niger is a place we see that, where people are migrating to the coast, sending money back. So these shouldn't be viewed as sort of disparate pathways. They're actually working together to diversify risk and create the potential for an increased capital for agriculture. There are some extremely important caveats around diversifying livelihood risk, however. In a lot of cases, people are actually dropping out of whether farming or livestock. And so they may be engaging in some activity, but at a very low return. So that's not a measure of diversifying livelihood risk. It's a proxy for chronic poverty and vulnerability. So the measurement is kind of tricky, and I'll actually have Tim speak to that a little bit on the panel.
Come in online as well. A recent scientific review article looked at issues of validation for measures of resilience, and then there's a quote from the article: a choice of valid resilience measures for use with different populations is urgently needed to underpin commissioning of new research in a public health, human well-being, and policy context. The related question is, what are the most important measures of resilience that university researchers should work on validating first?
Yeah, I think I'm going to kick that one to the panel and let Tim take that on, because he's going to talk about this evolution of resilience measurement. I do want to caution people, this isn't about what's the right 5 indicators. It's actually about a difference in approach to measurement to get at what are these sources of resilience realized in relation to shocks and stresses, and then index against an outcome of interest. Here you may be interested in food security, but the reality is resilience is sector agnostic. That outcome of interest could be education attainment, or we had an interesting discussion in Ethiopia with our education colleagues, and I said, what was the impact of the drought on education and people remaining in school? And people hadn't really thought about it that way. They didn't think resilience was relevant to education. It is relevant to every single sector we work in, given the complex risk environments in which we work. So there's a lot of questions. We do have a full panel, very capable panel, to help answer these questions. And I'll also, in addition to chairing the panel, be able to answer some questions as they come up as well. So I think we can transition to the panel. Great, thank you. All right. From standing to sitting. All right, this is good because this is going to build off a question that was just asked. So I've talked about how resilience measurement has evolved significantly over the last 5 years, from heated discussions about what was the right proxy outcome indicator to capture resilience, to an understanding that resilience isn't an outcome, it's an ability defined by a set of capacities or resilience capacities, realized in relation to shocks and stresses, and indexed against a variety of outcomes of interest, be it hunger, poverty, or malnutrition. Is this not working? Okay. So Tim, as somebody at the forefront of the field, can you talk a little bit about the basic tenets of resilience measurement and some of the innovative tools and approaches being used in this space? And then John and Nancy, feel free to chime in, because all three of these folks are heavily involved in the emergent field of resilience measurement.
Thanks, Greg. It's always interesting to be on the bleeding edge of things. One of the things that we're trying very hard to do is understand that resilience is essentially a means to an end. So what we're not trying to say is that if you're improving resilience, it's a substitute for any of your sector activities. You still want to have good sector interventions that you're promoting, but you don't want shocks and stresses to prevent you from achieving those successes. So you're trying to program that into what you're actually doing. So one of the things that we have to do when we try to measure resilience is understand the kinds of shocks and stresses that people are exposed to, both from an objective perspective as well as a subjective perspective. So objectively, we have early warning systems that operate using satellite imagery. We have rainfall data that we're collecting so we can know whether a drought hit, or we have flood data that we collect. But we also are very interested in the people themselves, what their perceptions of those shocks and stresses are. Because if they're important to them, they will acknowledge it. Sometimes when people are exposed to the same shock over and over and over again, they may not acknowledge that the drought is actually here. They'll just say, well, it's drier than it used to be. And we found that in places like Niger, where you actually had an ongoing drought, but people weren't acknowledging that the drought was happening, so they weren't taking responsive activities as a result of that. So it's really important to get both the subjective and objective measurements. The other thing we learned about shocks is that they're interconnected. So you may have a major covariant shock like a drought, but it leads to livestock disease. And then the livestock disease leads to everybody selling off their animals at the same time, so it creates a market shock. So you have a terms of trade problem that's created. And so then people are responding to the market shock by going to other places to take their animals for pasture and water. That creates a conflict shock. So these, you can actually, one of the advantages of looking at this information, collecting it after a shock is triggered and collecting the information every 2 months, is you actually can see how these things are connected, what responses people are doing to those shocks and stresses over time, and how good they actually are coping with the situation. What we've been really interested in, if you're going to really measure resilience, you have to actually watch what happens to people in real time when they're actually dealing with the shock. And so this recurrent monitoring system that we've been setting up in a number of countries allows us to do that. So that's kind of a new innovative thing that we've been implementing more recently. The other thing that's really important is these capacities. If you are a livelihood fan and you took a long time to finally get down the livelihood framework, you don't have to abandon that. All of these assets that are part of the livelihood framework make up what we're interested in looking at these different capacities, but in additional other capabilities and capacities that we maybe didn't highlight in the livelihood framework. But the point is that people rely on social capital, they rely on their human capital, they rely on these natural resources, they rely on their physical capital, they rely on political capital. All of these things are important for them to be able to manage risk. Which things are more important will vary from one context to the next. The other thing that's important is that these things are not unlimited. So people may use up some of these assets first as they initially respond, and that means it's not available to them later on as they're responding to these downstream shocks. So social capital might be something very important for helping people manage in the beginning, but later on it becomes not as important because they've used up most of that social capital in the beginning. So one of the reasons why it's so important to understand this range of capabilities, things that we kind of lump under absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities, is that all of these things have a role to play sometime during the actual shock event that people are experiencing. Finally, one of the things that we recognize is that to really build resilience, you need time. You can't do it in 2 years, you can't do it in 5 years. Now, most funding agencies will never give you a project more than 5, maybe 7 years, but they can't really do that, a 15-year project. But what's important is that you have a 15-year strategy working in an area so that you actually see, as you build each of these different capacities, how they're contributing to building resilience. And one of the capacities, the set of capacities that are probably most important that we've learned is this transformative capacity. These are the enabling conditions, the policies, the infrastructure, the normative change that has to be in place that allows people to be able to manage these shocks and stresses. These transformative capacities essentially create the enabling conditions for households and communities to have good absorptive and adaptive capacity. So any place where, and then this comes back to this issue about fragile environments, in places where we have very weak transformative capacity, even though we are building this absorptive and adaptive capacity for these households, if the shock is too great, they will not be able to absorb it. And so that's why it's so important to think about this longer-term development, building up these enabling conditions that allow you to have good investments around these other capacities that you're actually trying to support.
Great, thanks, Tim. I am going to put up this Features of a Resilience Measurement. It's a framework developed by Mark Consis, Tim Frankenberger, and John Hodnott. It's very small in font. We do have copies out on the table for you to take with you. So I just wanted you to have that reference point. Nancy or John, do you want to chime in on the measurement piece?
Sure. One thing, referring back to what you'd mentioned earlier, Greg, about we're dealing with a systems problem, a complex systems problem, and we can't get away from that. So, one of our measurement issues here is really separating out signals and noise. And I would have to say that we're getting a lot closer to doing that in the sense that we now have panel data, dynamic data, and we are actually better able to identify how households and communities are responding to shocks, and then using the iteration between quantitative and qualitative techniques, zeroing in on those capacities that are most important in that particular context. And so I think that the factors that we need to really monitor over time are these well-being outcomes, and identifying those particular capacities that seem to be operating to produce good well-being in the face of shocks and stress.
Yeah, just a couple quick additions on things that I've seen that are pretty innovative on the data collection side. I think Tim laid out what is tends to be a pretty data-heavy approach with high-frequency panel data. There's sort of limited applications we can have of those approaches. So looking at secondary sources and seeing how we can tap those. So one example we're pursuing in Nepal is looking at cell phone data records, which include things like top-up time, length of calls, or the network of calls, things that turns out actually indicate socioeconomic status. So seeing if we can leverage some of that kind of data to be able to look at well-being over time in a much sort of higher frequency, more spatially resolved approach, I think could open up a lot of doors to similar kind of analysis. And then just on the other side of the spectrum, really low tech is some of the work around what we're referring to as subjective measures of resilience, which is crudely asking people their own perceptions of if they feel like they can or have been able to withstand a shock or stress. And then the validation piece of that is key, which is I think FAO and ODI are looking at this of how do those subjective measures link to more of the objective measures that we've been able to analyze through some of these primary studies. And if that comes out as a close link, then I think that opens up a lot of possibilities as well for lighter touch measurement.
Great, and I think on that same front, measurement around social capital, there is signals and noise, but we do have clarity that it does matter, the ability to lean on other households. A lot of American audience responses, well, how would you know whether you'd be able to lean on another household? The reality of the places we're talking about, you know damn well whether you are in a reciprocal obligation network that you can lean on, and you can lean on it because you're expected to be leaned on yourself. So there's a lot of sort of iteration around these measurement approaches, particularly around measures of self-perception, around some of the psychosocial and social capital ones, and we'll get that into that in a minute. But I did also want to, Tim, ask you about this heterogeneity of pathways, what I described as stepping up, stepping out, moving out. What is the evidence around that? I mentioned some important caveats around that. Maybe you could talk to that a little bit. And then if you have time, what this looks like in the context of a place like the Horn of Africa.
So one of the things that we're trying to build evidence over location and over time. So we have data collection going on in a number of different countries, and we want to see if some of the patterns that we're seeing actually hold up in many locations. One of the things that is coming out is when we talk about livelihood diversification, we often just count up the number of activities that people are engaged in terms of income-generating activities and say, well, that person is more diversified than that person. But what we're finding is that doesn't necessarily mean that they're better adapted to these shocks and stresses. And one of the things that our research is showing is that it's being able to adapt to different risk profiles that's key here. So not just the number of activities that you engage in, but the fact that you engage in things that are exposed to different risk profiles. So in places like Ethiopia, Borana region, for example, what we found is that people that not only were engaged in livestock and agriculture, but also were engaged in other market activities that weren't exposed to the same kinds of shock, were much better able to manage the shock than those that weren't. Now, the other thing that's important here is that not everybody has the same set of opportunities. So when we look at what's been going on in a number of these pastoral areas in the Horn, we found that some households actually were able to take their assets and they're diversifying their income sources and actually increase the size of their herds. And part of this had to do with being privatizing of land in the area. Now, some people actually were not able to maintain their herds and were not able to find good pasture, so some of those people dropped out. What we also found, though, is those people that kind of stayed in might have actually had somebody move to the town to send back remittances, so that migration become an important strategy for people to actually manage that situation. So one of the things we've learned from this is that it doesn't help to separate out rural versus urban, or those people that are involved in livelihood systems in rural areas versus those in urban. You have to think about the rural-urban continuum as one system, and how people work in urban areas support their work in rural areas and vice versa. And so thinking a little bit more broadly on the way people actually manage shocks and stresses, I think is really important. We had a bunch of livestock guys in a meeting in Addis, and it was a light bulb went off when they actually realized investing in urban areas actually improved the livestock sector when they started understanding these connections. And so, we have to kind of think differently when we think about resilience. It's not just one environment versus another, but it's both that are key here.
Great, and I think it is important that a lot of diversification outside of agriculture we see is dropping out in some of these far-flung, marginalized rural areas. So in terms of investment, well, we've been investing an awful lot in terms of agricultural pathways. We need to rethink about, in addition to that, which will always be the engine of the economies in these places, are we adequately investing in expanding the opportunities for people to step out and move out, given that's the pathway some are going to be on? And so what I really like about the new global food security strategy is it gives space to recognize that heterogeneity of pathways. Tim, you've already spoke a little bit about migration. We did have a very interesting piece of evidence from our Resilience Evidence Forum from Bangladesh, a randomized control trial. Can you speak to that briefly?
Yes. So one of the things that prevents poor people from actually migrating is the cost of transportation and being able to actually feed yourself while you're looking for a job. So that, if you're at the margin, it's very difficult to make that decision to go. And so what was attempted by IPA, what is it?
IPA, Innovative Poverty Action, and Yale University.
Yeah. What they did was they actually did a randomized control trial where they gave somewhere between $8 and $15 to some groups, they gave food to some groups, and then they had a control group, and they actually watched to see what happened when these people actually migrated. And what they found was giving them that little boost, that little extra resource, made a huge difference in them actually going out, and so people started migrating and realized that that was a viable strategy for them to provide remittances back home, and it actually helped them provide another meal during the lean season that they didn't have before. And so not only that, but after the experiment was over, they found that these people were continually to do it now that they realized how valuable it was to do. So now they're scaling up this program. It started out fairly small, but now it's being scaled up, large area in Bangladesh, as a way to help manage these shocks and stresses that people are exposed to in these flooded areas of Bangladesh.
Yeah, I think the statistics are it increased expenditure as a proxy for income by 30 to 35%, and it increased caloric consumption by 750 calories per person per day. So the equivalent of a meal. This isn't people ditching agriculture to migrate. This is people saying, I need to have a mix here, in which, and again, I think some of that increase in expenditure could be into agricultural investment. Okay, so we did recently have this Resilience Evidence Forum that really highlighted a variety of sources of resilience across different contexts. Tim, can you give some of the highlights from that growing body of evidence and what it suggests in terms of programmatic areas we need to begin to focus on in addition to our core areas that we already invest? Similarly, Nancy, can you talk to some of the sources of resilience that I mentioned that transcend sectors such as social capital, women's empowerment, aspiration, both in terms of what the evidence is suggesting, but also in terms of the policy and programming ramifications of that evidence? Tim?
Okay. One of the things that we found when we looked at work that we've been doing in Ethiopia, in Kenya, Uganda, Burkina Faso, and Niger, was that social capital was really an important factor that enabled people to manage these shocks and stresses effectively. And we often talk about three types of social capital. So one we call bonding social capital. This is where you have relationships between people within a community that help each other out, that try to provide informal safety nets to each other, provide labor. Bridging social capital, this is where you are, like this example we just gave about somebody going and sending remittances back home. Somebody goes to an urban area, or it could be a Somali going to Minnesota, and they start sending resources back to the community, and those resources actually help the agriculture and livestock production in those communities. And so this bridging social capital really makes a difference because they're not exposed to the same kind of risk profile. And then finally, what we call linking social capital. This is where you have connections to people in higher places that you might, through that connection, you might be able to get resources more quickly from that particular government agency or the NGO or the private sector to help you recover from the particular shock that you're exposed to. And what we found, Daniel Aldridge in his work in New Orleans actually found, was that people that had stronger social capital were able to recover much more quickly than those that didn't. And he looked at this across multiple places where these tsunami shocks or hurricane shocks had been hitting, and what was the main ingredient that actually made a difference in enabling people to manage those shocks more effectively. So social capital came out very strong, not only in our data, but in other people's work in other places. We also found that financial services, and maybe John can talk a little bit about that, but financial services also are an important factor that has a big influence on enabling people to adapt to the changing environment that they're dealing with. And so being able to diversify into other income generating activities, being able to rely on those resources so that you can get back on your feet quickly if you've lost assets. These things are critical for being able to manage these shocks and stresses. Do you want to say something about that?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, let me do my segue in here in that, like Dan Aldrich, I lived in New Orleans during Katrina, and but unlike Dan Aldridge, I still live in New Orleans, and I was able to actually upfront and personal witness how recovery occurred and participate in the recovery process and so forth. And the social capital, the thing that struck Dan Aldrich and really motivated a lot of his work was the very striking differences between ethnic groups and their response, their social capital, and their ability to respond and repopulate and reconstruct their neighborhoods. So it was particularly the case in some of the more ethnically heterogeneous neighborhoods, and also in the Vietnamese community. Those were very, very strong examples. And the Vietnamese were really up and going within a year. They really had reconstituted their neighborhoods. They had undertaken a great deal of collective action to change policy in Washington. They had developed both, they had both strong bonding capital, bridging capital across other ethnic communities, as well as linking capital up to national levels to inform policy, change policy with respect to the way that recovery occurred in those neighborhoods. So the very striking or very salient findings in New Orleans, I think, informed and generated a lot of interest in this concept, in this construct of social capital. One thing that we need to take into account is also the very dramatic changes in what is traditional social capital with respect to trust and community organizations and volunteerism and so forth. In high-income countries, this has been going down, and new forms of social capital are emerging, such as social networks and so forth. But where we are working in most low-income countries, the traditional forms are still pretty important, powerful influences on behaviors and on resilience. Another contextual factor here is the rapid emergence of decision science, behavioral economics, and psychology. This is really recent. I mean, it's really a powerful motivator to look at things like aspirations, individual psychological variables that actually also link to social relations and social capital, and the importance of things like risk perception, aspirations, self-efficacy, and the confidence to adapt, to change. These are these individual psychological factors that, frankly, we have not paid much attention to in development or humanitarian work. Tim and Greg both discussed the subjective resilience. There's also subjective well-being and humanitarian assistance, and the way that we deliver any assistance can actually affect subjective well-being. One of the findings that I generated from a study in Haiti was that basically the form and the way that we deliver humanitarian assistance was actually causing depression in populations. So these are really powerful things. Very exciting is the fact that both the National Academies of Science, looking at the measurement of civic engagement and cohesion in the United States, lots of experimentation and dynamic data from panels. It's all motivating us and generating a lot of new evidence on these psychosocial variables. And of course, most recently, Michael Freezy's work, randomized control trials with 500 Togolese small business owners in 3 arms that basically showed that trainings that focused more on entrepreneurial thought patterns were far more effective in generating profits and positive business outcomes than were traditional ways of teaching. So all of these leading sort of contextually to the importance of these psychosocial variables. Now our conference too generated many encouraging signs that we're making some progress in both understanding these variables and in understanding how they affect resilience. The conference had basically data from many different sites, had quantitative, had qualitative data, Uganda, Somalia, Nepal, Kenya, Sahel, the Philippines, varying definitions of social capital measurement, as well as aspirations, risk perception, self-efficacy, and empowerment. These are not measured in a standard way at this point. And in some sense, probably they will never be totally measured in a standard way. But, and I'll come back to this a little later, I think one of the, sort of the directions for the future is really doing a stock taking, because we're doing lots of different approaches to social capital measurement, to aspirations, and the psychological variables. And we probably can get a little more standardized and enabling a little better comparability across sites. Now, there are also varying definitions of resilience outcomes. So we look at things like recovery time, food security, investment decisions, asset change, positive and negative coping behaviors. And again, another really big and important development so far as resilience measurement is concerned is that we are seeing many more panel studies, many more dynamic time series, and then also RCTs. So there were RCTs this round. Now, in contrast to 3 to 4 years ago, we were largely dealing with large cross-sectional data sets. And so what were some of the findings from the learning event? Well, bonding social capital is important in almost all places, but as Tim measured, it's not enough. Bonding social capital is probably the first level of social capital. It tends to actually be fairly robust in many environments, but it gets exhausted relatively quickly in the face of shocks. Effect size from a lot of our studies are modest, which means probably we're still not perhaps measuring as well as we could, or we need to do more to look at what really does affect the efficacy of bonding capital. So there were some other important findings about social capital. One is that social capital can actually negatively influence resilience or create vulnerability. And we know that social capital can be negative or it can be positive. It can be negative because bonding capital leads to exclusionary policies. It could be negative because social collective action can actually be bad. Say the Rwanda genocide. That was probably an excellent example of collective action, social capital, but it led to very negative outcomes. So we have to be concerned about that. The particular influence of bridging and linking social capital seems to be far more highly contextualized than does bonding social capital. So interrelationships among groups and connections to authority and to higher levels of governance, is very highly contextual in terms of its effects on resilience. That probably, in plain terms, is a function of weak state structures or weak governance structures, and over-reliance on them can, in fact, have negative resilience outcomes. Women's empowerment, and I think Tim will say a little bit about findings from Bangladesh on that, but there were several studies looking at women's empowerment, particularly, if not uniquely. Empowerment in general is a very important factor influencing resilience, but women's empowerment, particularly reducing gender equity gaps, is quite important for resilience, and where, from whether we look at it from a societal level or from a community level, that we see positive outcomes on resilience from women's empowerment interventions. And aspirations and self-efficacy have also come out now from many studies as being important predictors of resilience. Panel data establishment of temporal relationships, because one of the issues with a lot of these subjective factors is establishing the temporal relationship between the psychological factor and resilience outcomes. So panel data has helped in that regard, as has recent and pretty exciting work on, from randomized control trials on aspirations in Ethiopia, and the persistence of change in aspirations and in behavioral outcomes linked to aspirations like, for example, education, investments in children. And then we wanted to interpret this in context and also what it means programmatically, as Greg had mentioned. There has been an enormous investment in social capital creation almost as a byproduct of many other interventions, whether it's natural resource management or whether it's the creation of farmers groups, farmers field schools, cooperatives, and so forth. Jules Petty in 2003 published a science article that stated between 1990 and 2003 about 500,000 organizations, groups were created by development investments. That's a lot. Now, since then, we've had the proliferation of microfinance and VSLA groups. So we know we now have created quite a bit of social capital. What the question is, have we, maximized its impact and its influence on resilience outcomes? Probably not. So probably we need to do a lot more in the how of our investments, how we're creating social capital, how we're influencing aspirations and confidence, constructing approaches that really address the hows. And so I think from a policy program perspective, the hows are quite important. And then I would say there are 3 points about the directions and looking at these factors in the future I'd like to set up. One is we have to continue to stress the need for panel studies and experiments, light touch, maybe experiments as opposed to heavy randomized control trials. And we have to do it in different ecological and social cultural contexts. We need to do that, and we need to do it when it's appropriate with respect to resilience interventions. The experiments are particularly appropriate when we have relatively focused interventions, like trying to change aspirations, for example. Not so appropriate when we're dealing with a large package of interventions. And then I would recommend stock taking for the diversity of measures we're using for these psychosocial variables. We're a little too sloppy. We can beg off on contextualization, but honestly, that only goes so far. And really, I think we need to do a stock taking, and I think there's a good scope for a task in that area. And then we need to mainstream psychological and psychosocial assessments and integrate them into the development of our theories of change and our implementation strategies.
Great. Tim, did you want to quickly talk to the Bangladesh Women's Empowerment finding? I've actually got it up on the screen.
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to say 2 things about this. One is sometimes we collect data for another purpose. Maybe we're doing an impact evaluation of a project, but in fact we can go back using a resilience lens and re-look at that data and actually find out quite a bit about what factors are actually contributing to resilience. And one of the things that we really were impressed with when we did that in this study of the Shahardo program, that's a Title II project that was funded in Bangladesh, is that women's empowerment made a huge difference with regards to people being able to manage the floods in those areas. In places where we had high empowerment, and this is criteria that were developed by CARE as part of their program there, and I can give you that specific information if you want it later. What they found, though, was, and it has a lot to do with women's ability to make decisions in their own household and their mobility to actually go out and seek employment opportunities. So where it was high empowerment, we actually saw them even doing better in managing that flood. Where it was very low empowerment, we actually saw that it wasn't making that, it was actually worse off. People were worse off in dealing with the flood. So women's empowerment is a very powerful normative change that we are seeing makes a difference in people's ability to manage shocks and stresses. And so we want to do more investment in this kind of work and collect this kind of data in other locations so that we can actually see if it holds up in multiple places.
Yeah, and I think what's powerful about that is every single person in this room could rationalize investing and empowering women for its own sake. It is a good outcome on its own sake. But the more we can show through analytics, it actually has value in addition to that, that it makes households more resilient. It becomes very powerful. And I think it clicks on the light bulb for a lot of people of why things like women's empowerment are so important. Before I go to John, I also want to just stress here that we recently had this Resilience Evidence Forum. What we're sort of highlighting here are the things people don't typically think of. We've done an awful lot of investment in crop and pest disease tolerant crops, including the work by Laoli in Niger. We've got investments in Maradi, where he's done his research that are profoundly important to our Feed the Future and other investments. We've got the farmer-managed natural regeneration, the regreening of 5 million hectares in Niger as well. So none of this is to say that the investments, our core investment in agriculture, aren't a central pillar, but it is to say that not everybody's going to farm or herd their way out of this. There is a set of sources of resilience that fundamentally matter as well, and that this type of measurement works really push the boundaries in terms of what we think of, pushing people to think beyond technical sectors, which is awful difficult in organizations that hire people on the basis of their technical sectors. So it really is pushing us in new and interesting ways. So that's a good segue to John. John works for Mercy Corps and has been heavily engaged in resilience and resilience measurement. One tool they've used is their strategic resilience assessment approach, known as STRESS, which tries to get at some of this complexity. So could you talk a little bit about what STRESS is, how it's used, and how it's influenced and shaped programming on the ground? In other words, why it's not just new wine, old wine in new bottles. Also, if you are able, as an implementing agent, what have you seen as the biggest successes and challenges in translating the concept and principles of resilience programming into practice, and what role do evidence play, research and evidence play in that? But before you get started, we thought we'd mix it up a bit and play a short video that outlines the STRESS approach in Karamoja, Uganda. Let's see if I can actually do this now.
Welcome. This is Karamoja. We are young and growing. Many of us grew up with violent conflict and food insecurity. The ways we live and work are changing. A decline in livestock forced many households to grow more crops, but yields can be unpredictable. Some are settling further away to find land. Others are moving to small and growing towns to find new opportunities, go to school, and access health services. We have a strong vision for an empowered Karamoja, but our future remains uncertain. From conflict to unpredictable rainfall, repeated shocks make it hard to catch up and almost impossible to get ahead.
With the support of USAID, Mercy Corps and our partners conducted a strategic resilience assessment, or STRESS. Together, we deepened our understanding of Karamoja, learning which groups are most vulnerable to shocks and stresses, and identifying the resilience capacities they need to stay on track. Using STRESS, we trace the impact of shocks. For example, unpredictable rain can damage crops, reducing income, increasing food prices, and sending urban Karamojong back to rural communities for food and housing. During dry periods, women and girls must walk farther from home for firewood and water, increasing their vulnerability and threatening their future. Men and boys responsible for livestock must also travel farther for water and grazing land, leaving families behind and risking conflict over scarce resources. STRESS identified the capacities people need to learn and adapt. What if communities had the information to manage risk? Farmers could access specialized products. Women had access to financial services. What if communities could invest in and manage their land? Strengthening these resilience capacities will help Karamoja move forward. Let's work together now to build a strong foundation for the future. From education and health services to governance and civic engagement, everyone will have a role to play in building an empowered Karamoja. Please join us.
All right. Hard to be more eloquent than that, but let me give it a shot and see if I can break it down in ways that Greg was asking. So having been a part of developing some of these frameworks and running some of these analytical models and coming up with colorful videos, we get a lot of questions and demands from our field team saying, great, all that looks really nice, and what is it that I'm supposed to be doing different? And for a long time, we really sort of struggle with that. So this assessment process that we're calling STRESS was one way to help people get their heads around what is this thing we're calling resilience and how do you apply it in your context. And I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of what I think stands out as sort of unique and powerful around it. One is that it really incorporates a strong focus on understanding risks. And we've talked about that in various ways. And I'll highlight kind of how that plays out and what difference it's made for us in Karamoja. And then the second is it's an assessment process that really tries to look at some of these systemic issues that people rely on or are barriers to their ability to cope with those risks. And again, I'll give an example there around how that played out in Nepal. So on the understanding risk side, in Karamoja, as with a lot of other places in East Africa, some risks are really obvious. You've got drought, you've got conflict, you've got livestock disease, but others are a bit more hidden, and then oftentimes some of the interactions between these shocks and stresses play out in ways that are more detrimental than they appear on the surface. So through this assessment process in Karamoja, one thing that really stood out was the risks around this transition of livelihoods, largely from pastoralism to more settled agricultural livelihoods. And this is part of a bigger policy push amongst the government of Uganda to be able to have not just increased food security, but having Karamojong have better access to services and other things that are important and good development goals. But along with that transition, we saw that there were a number of risks that came about. So first was just higher vulnerability to drought. So great that people are growing food in good years, but what we saw a couple years ago when there was just a moderate drought, that actually families that had more or less sort of stepped all the way out of pastoralism or a good bit out didn't have that fallback of livestock, which are obviously much more drought adapted in that part of the country. So again, short-term food security gains through the sort of settlement and agricultural development, but during a downturn and a drought emergency, we saw that some of those policy changes were more risky. Similarly, over the long term, from an ecological perspective, this opening of new land to cultivation, which we were supportive of, also has long-term effects on soil quality, grazing availability, and so from a rangeland management perspective, really poses risk over the long term. And any of you who are rangeland management experts can kind of fill in there. But just as an example, based on some of those insights from this process around increased risks for what seems to be a smart development strategy in the region, we sort of stepped back and said, okay, maybe we shouldn't be just pursuing a program approach that is really working on input supply. I think we had subsidies for tillage, other things to get agriculture going, and instead we started collaborating a lot more with the government of Uganda on smart land use policy, where we're trying to preserve, especially some of the marginal lands that were being cultivated for more traditional pastoral activities that we did see as more resilient in those areas. And that's something that I'm pretty certain wouldn't have happened without us stepping back and kind of looking at the approach and the context through this lens. So the other example is in Nepal, and it really highlights sort of the systemic issues that these types of assessments can really bring to light. So there in the far west of Nepal, we've had a major food security program going, and at the design stage, it was reasonably innovative. We're looking at alternative livelihoods through improving access to markets, financial services, as well as some more traditional things like strengthening disaster risk reduction, risk management functions in these villages. And these were all mostly geared towards helping these households adapt and absorb to shocks that included floods and landslides and market shocks in that region. But going through this assessment process really spotlighted some of the more structural issues around both social systems and political systems that really were just barriers, as it turned out, for any of those other achievements to really get traction. So those of you who know Nepal, this won't come as a surprise, but the strict gender and caste norms combined with the sort of the weak as well as almost inequitable governance in a lot of areas really make it such that especially lower and excluded castes don't really have access to markets, financial services, a lot of the natural resources that we were trying to improve. So no amount of investment into those we soon realized would support resilience amongst these marginalized castes. So in this case, we shifted gears and really took an approach that was much more focused on building the agency and voice of these disenfranchised groups, women, minority groups, both within formal structures of local governance, water users associations, DRR committees, et cetera, as well as in more informal groups where they had the ability to be able to have sort of safe space to cultivate their basically advocacy abilities to be able to demand more services and rights. So I think, again, just another one where sort of a real shift in how we ended up programming there, still towards a food security and livelihood ends, but in a very different route based on the barriers that we saw towards resilience and the risks people face. So that's really the stress approach. I think I can leave it there and then maybe try to weave in other comments in response to questions from the group.
Yeah, and hopefully there will be lots of questions. There was one last question I wanted to ask, maybe as a way of segueing to a broader discussion with those of you who have shown your resilience and remained in the session. And that's the role of U.S. universities. We've talked a lot about some of the innovations in measurement, both in approach, the analytics, but it'd be great to get people's thoughts, and I would open that well beyond this panel, to get people's thoughts on what the role of U.S. universities is and can be in further building the evidence base for resilience. I do note when we had our Resilience Evidence Forum, we had some great contributions from Yale, Tufts, Cornell, Tulane, George Washington, people who brought evidence to the table that was part of the discussion. So it's not as though we're starting from scratch, but how can we tap the innovation and excellence of U.S. universities, particularly I'll be honest, we struggle a little bit on this resilience measurement piece in terms of having a broad set of people who are familiar with this approach and can even improve upon it. We've got a small stable of people who are sort of cutting edge, but it is small, and it cannot possibly meet up the demand, not only demand of donors and partners, but of governments. The government of Kenya has requested support on resilience measurement. We're struggling to meet the demand. So I think there's potential here. I don't know, Nancy, maybe you're well positioned to offer a few thoughts.
Yes, I mean, as you mentioned, the U.S. universities are pretty involved, and including some of the land-grant universities. I think the really interesting application of U.S. university talent to the resilience problem is in higher education partnership programs to build resilient higher education institutions in low-income countries. This is such a persistent problem that higher education is always on the end of the list of any donor's investment. Yet it is the leadership machines for the countries, and we've got to look at it that way. One of the things I've done over the years is I've worked with a number of public health institutions just because my primary appointment was in public health, and so we set up partnerships with, in Vietnam, Rwanda, Uganda with McCrary, and we had a very deliberate organizational development focus, not sort of a traditional go in there and provide assistance for educational programs or research or do joint research together, but we had a very deliberate organizational development strategy. And almost a sort of a graduation trajectory in the nature of our partnership. So we started with a lot of initial assistance, provided technical assistance in traditional ways, but transitioned to, in the case of the Resilient Africa Network, transitioned to a situation in which McCrary was actually the prime, and Tulane and others, Stanford, were sub-recipients on the agreement. And I think that model is quite interesting. I think as long as we ignore higher education in low-income countries, we really do risk not reaching societal level resilience. So just say in terms of the partnerships, and obviously there's quite a lot of opportunity for the research. Research is fairly sophisticated. Systems dynamics and so forth, I think, requires a very different level of analytical rigor. So there's a lot of scope for involvement on the research side as well.
Yeah, one of the things, I had a very interesting conversation with Brady and others this morning, and one of the things that, if you kind of follow the systems thinking, many of you that I've seen over the last several hours were part of the farming systems teams that we were actually engaged in the late 70s and early 80s. I'm giving away how old I am here. And then that moved to more livelihood-focused kind of approaches, and now resilience is building on that systems thinking as well. So over time, we've been trying to improve upon this kind of systems analysis that we're doing, and what we're finding is that getting the different disciplines to work together is not always easy, and it's almost like the university is working at cross purposes for this, and part of it has to do with the incentive structures that are in these universities with regards to, you get promoted or you get tenured because you're publishing in your sector-specific journals, but that doesn't necessarily reward working cross-sectorally. And now we've had attempts to actually build these institutions in a number of places that were more cross-sectoral, but even they have evolved to being more stovepipe sector-specific, again, because the scientists that are in those institutions are also working towards trying to get tenured and promotions because the whole incentive structure is set up that way. So one of the things that it's almost like it's a recurring theme that shows up every 10 years, We all recognize how important it is to work together in the systems approach. We recognize when you talk about farming systems, it's not just agronomy or economics, it's everything. And same thing when we went into food security. Again, it was nutrition and ag working together on food security issues. Then we moved into the livelihood approach. Each one of these has been kind of systems oriented, but they always seem to kind of fizzle out over time because this incentive structure is never lined up with this cross-sectoral perspective. And so what I'm worried about a little bit is I think that the universities have a great opportunity to participate, to get graduate students more involved in all this analysis, to try to make sure that, because as Greg has pointed out, we can't meet the demand as it currently is. We need to expand dramatically, not only using universities in Africa and other places, but even the university students that we have here in this country. We just need to rethink this struggle that we're having of trying to work on systems thinking type work cross-sectorally versus the incentive structures that are there. Because right now, very rarely do you get rewarded with working cross-sectorally in a university. And so, I had the advantage when I was at the University of Arizona that I worked in the Office of Arid Land Studies, which was very cross-sectoral. And so everybody I worked with was in a different discipline, so I was forced to work cross-sectorally. But that was kind of a rare thing, and it's harder and harder for those kind of institutions to get funding. So I think this is a structural problem that is going to be facing us as we move forward in trying to do more resilience measurement, more resilience programming, and I think we need to be very clear about it and not just ignore it.
I would just say that same structural challenge is reflected in donor agencies. You think it's tough for USAID, and it is tough. Look at the EU, ECHO and DEFCO, separate organizations for humanitarian and development. It's also very difficult for government ministries, and where we've seen this be successful, Kenya, Niger to some extent, although capacity is a challenge, they've set up cross-ministerial bodies that are designed to provide this linkage. Now, the challenge is that doesn't sit so well with ministries. particularly when it's a presidential decree or initiative. And the one lesson I take away, and it really just is so clear in the Kenya case, is where it does work is when you drop down from the national to the local and you get down to the county level. There, it's a lot easier to make it work. So anyway, with that, Brady, I'd like to thank the panel and then pass to you to questions. Perhaps a round of applause for the panel first.
Wonderful, and thank you, Greg, and panel members. It was extremely stimulating, and I know we have a lot of questions. I saw a whole dozen or so went up a while ago. So why don't we turn first with regard to addressing the panel directly to some of those questions that we had a moment ago. Kristen, you have the microphone. If you just lift your hand, and Kristen, we're going to mic to you. And we have 3 or 4 on the floor right now. 5 or 6, actually.
Thank you very much. My name is Kwesi Atakra, and I am with IITA. I really would like to thank all the panelists. I think it's been very exciting. But one question that I will put forefront for all of you to consider, how can we demystify what resilience actually stands for? How can we ensure that the concept of resilience does not become a discipline on its own? And how can we make sure that in talking about resilience, we're not talking about 5% of experts being good in resilience science, but we're really challenging ourselves, how can we actually integrate resilience thinking across the spectrum of whatever is happening? And it will not be perfect resilience analysis, but it will be better than where the 80% of all of us are. And for me, I think that those are the critical issues. Because even bringing it down to the last question that was asked about the US universities, one danger is that it makes the whole subject matter academic. A lot of people will sit back and say, you guys, you can do all the analysis you want to do. It's all academic. It doesn't solve my core problems on the ground. But I like the point that was made, Greg, that when you go down to the local level, things take a different shape. And I think we've got to begin to think about what mechanisms we can put in place to ensure that the partnership framework is such that we are bringing together the different entities, whether it is research groups, whether it is the development partners that are there, whether it is the private sector, whether it is the public domain, which are relevant for the particular place where we are targeting. And so that we can then begin to see how can we use some of the concepts that resilience science has generated and build it into the reality of the challenges that we have on the ground, so that we can actually diversify. You know, you mentioned why has farming systems come and gone, why has livelihood systems come and gone. I have been part of all that.
You've come and gone too.
Yes, I'm coming down too. That's why I'm so, really interested in this. And I think I've come to the point where I believe very strongly, unless we can find a way of aligning the science to the strategic goals of countries, where we can look at what is it that matters to the Minister of Agriculture. What are the key concerns there? They are talking about food security, yes? They are talking about import substitution. They are talking about job creation. They are talking about, probably environmental concerns. But here we are on the ground, getting into depth with all kinds of measurements without creating a link with those things that they talk about. So that's also another key to think. So it really is important that we have to ask ourselves these questions and see how we can modify the way we engage and how we can use the knowledge that we have generated to make sure that it percolates all the way through the system. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we take a few more and try and answer them together.
Yes, I'm Suleiman Al Hassan. I'm coming from Ghana, and a Humphrey Fellow at Cornell University. When you talk of resilience, it comes to mind, you have been mentioning so many countries in Africa, but I haven't heard about Ghana, because there is Northern Ghana Resiliency Project. And this project, I thank USAID very much, because I know how it has come to help vulnerable households in Northern Ghana. It has so many components, and I like the way it was structured. It's like that it's under the local government system, where they support water, they support nutrition, support agriculture, and they support the local government itself to be strengthened. We are very grateful for that. One area in which I was one of the focal persons implementing the project, but one area of my concern is post-harvest loss reduction. The project is supporting the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in the area of supplying PEX bags and also training the farmers. But I don't know, there is going forward, there is a worry there in terms of measurement of post-harvest loss reduction. We have no enough data, and even those that are available in Ghana are all estimates or extrapolations, calculations of percentage of post-harvest loss. The area where I would like for more support is how to come out with, we have a baseline of post-harvest loss reduction, especially of the grains. Because I'm here under capacity of how to reduce post-harvest on food security in Cornell University. So my concern is, I know there is a support for Africa in terms of post-harvest loss reduction. So I want to know what are the plans in terms of how to reduce post-harvest losses. Because in the US here, I know there's post-harvest loss innovation labs. It is my belief, it is my wish that we have an innovation lab or a post-harvest integrated center in Northern Ghana especially, and to assess the impact of what you are doing, so that we'll be able to know where is the direction of the post-harvest loss, what percentage are we doing in reducing it, because you are doing a great service to us. We need to measure the losses that we encounter, because for now, it is difficult to assess what percentage of loss reduction that we are incurring.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we take one more and then we'll begin.
Good afternoon. I'm Tobela Nkukwana from South Africa. I'm a lecturer at the University of Pretoria. Okay, thank you for the good presentations by the panel, but I always go back to say the problems that are faced by most developing countries are a lack of adoption and use of technologies that are brought down as intervention strategies. And if you have come to a point where you say going to the communities other than approaching it at national level has worked better, then it means there is no cohesion between what our governments and what the people on the ground are actually doing. Because at some point, social capital needs to convert to cultural capital, where what is being taught or what has been taught over time, over the years, as farming systems, as improvements in livelihoods, because the information is there. The information is there, it is documented, it is available on the internet, it is available in the booklets. The use of that information by extension and government officials, that is what is lacking. Because the people may be willing to adopt and use the information, but as to how that is Okay, English has run out. As to how that is brought down to the communities that are supposed to use that, that is where the problem is. Because the USAID will, and the EU will continue to intervene, bring down aid, and as much support as possible to improve food security. But what are our states or governments doing about it to make sure that what is being taught and is adopted, becomes resilience and social capital, becomes a practice and a culture amongst the farming communities?
Great, thank you. I mean, maybe we'll
Greg, may I just say that for the audience, we wanted to turn now to the panel response, as Greg had indicated, but be aware that you will have chance for further discussion. We have a significant time allocated for general discussion with BIFAD. And before you, the panel leaves, if you would give us the time, I'd like to at least turn to BIFAD colleagues to see if they have particular questions based on what you've said also. Then we will go through another round then once we don't want to keep you up there the rest of the day, but we're
quite enjoying it. So
yes. So you can stay with us either way you want to do that. So we're happy for that too.
So maybe I can offer some initial thoughts. I mean, I think, Suleiman, I'm well aware of the RING program, the Resilience in Northern Ghana program. The reason I wasn't mentioning it, it doesn't fit that narrower criteria of people in places where we're seeing repeat large-scale humanitarian spending, which was one of the costs that I highlighted in my presentation. But as I said, this broader relevance of resilience absolutely to the Northern Ghana case. I think in terms of the post-harvest loss question, you've got some other folks at USAID who are probably, including Rob Bertram here, can probably answer what the sort of latest science on that is in terms of measurement. But I think it's well understood. It was raised in the first panel as well. This certainly isn't only about production. It's also about post-harvest losses. It's also about market systems. And what we've tried to portray today is it's also about looking at people who are stepping out and moving out of agriculture as a pathway, a sustainable and resilient pathway out of poverty. It's also about governance. It's also about human capital. And to our first colleague's point, this does run the risk of becoming the kitchen sink, so inclusive that it's meaningless. And I think we, in some ways, threw the kitchen sink at some of the problems, the problem being recurrent crisis and repeat large-scale humanitarian emergencies, knowing full well that we'd have to enter into a measurement regime to allow us to tease out what are the actual sources of resilience that matter most. We're not just throwing everything at the problem. Maybe just to turn to that question a little bit and then pass the rest of the panel to Kwesi's question about let's demystify. I think we're in a constant struggle to demystify. And I think one of the most powerful ways to demystify is to bring people places where it's happening. So some of the things we've done in that regard is we're funding the government of Haiti to go see what's happening in Kenya and Ethiopia. We actually used the folks who supported the government of Kenya in building out its Ending Drought Emergencies initiative to support the government of Malawi and their national resilience strategy that's just being finalized now. So trying to get this experience moved around away from people who sit on panels to people who are actually on the ground driving this work. Similarly, within USAID, this is a constant struggle, which is part of the reason a week and a half ago we brought together all the resilience coordinators from across the globe together to learn from one another. And it was one of the most beautiful moments of my life because I could stop back and stop trying to explain, and they could tell each other how it works on the ground. But I do take to heart your challenge, and I think a healthy warning. Let us not have resilience become a discipline or a sector. Let's have sectors and disciplines recognize that every single one of them should be concerned about resilience because of their particular sectoral outcome they're interested in, and that we can't build resilience without all sectors coming together because it can't be built through single sector, single discipline. So let me turn to the rest of the panel.
Well, one of the things that I think what we're trying to do too is, I mentioned this earlier, we're trying to take existing data sets that were collected for other reasons and use a resilience lens to actually look at that data from a different perspective. And the advantage of that is that the people that were using it for a different purpose actually see things that they didn't take into account that were really important for allowing a certain population to be more resilient or not. The other thing that we're also trying to do is we're trying to get people to really think of it as a means, not an end. And so if you're trying to program the best agricultural intervention that makes sense in that particular area, it doesn't mean that you don't try to do the best you can with best practice. It means you want to make sure that if that area is facing recurrent shocks, that doesn't derail your attempt to actually put that good agriculture in place. Just like in the health sector, we want to make sure that people understand that there are certain things that they need to take into account if recurrent shocks could disrupt the health system that are operating in an area. Or like Greg already pointed out, how education is affected by these recurrent shocks and what you have to take into account if you're really trying to make sure that the local population actually keeps their kids in school. So we're trying to take basically a resilience lens and apply it to different sector experiences so that people can actually see why it's important to take this into account as a means to an end. You're trying to make sure that the shocks don't disrupt your ability to actually achieve your objectives that you're trying to go for.
Maybe just an example of how we felt like we've kind of broken this down in a way that hopefully gets over this, this thing being this kind of a mystic idea that nobody really knows what to do with. It's not an ag example, but hopefully folks can get their head around it. Really in the financial services sector, which I think Tim and others have called out as, okay, this is an important source of resilience. The people that work in that sector, or the technical people, immediately come back and say, great, out of the 12 things that we typically do, from VSLAs all the way to, reinsurance on an international level, what within our toolkit should we be doing differently? And so taking this kind of first cut of research and breaking that down further to say, okay, there's almost a decision support tool on, if you're looking at early recovery, we're talking about informal financial services. If we're talking about risk reduction, it's actually going to be business loans, and sort of the range of things to, I guess, for the researchers to take a few more steps, not to sort of silo it into sectors, but at least to go a few more steps down some technical paths to give real concrete answers.
Yes, and I guess in response to Chrissy's query about the 5% experts and what you do about that. Well, that goes back to one point, I think my point about higher education in low-income countries and leadership machines. We've got to transfer that capacity, and it's doable. Actually, there hasn't been enough. One of the things we lack, there hasn't been enough emphasis on the returns on investment for higher education partnerships and organizational development, I think. A lot about this resilience thing is teaching people how to learning to learn, because you can't do everything at once. Now you can sequence, and I think that the Resilience Center has been really well focused on how do you sequence interventions, where do you start, where do you actually get the greatest bang, can you make those wins on aspirational changes and so forth, so that people, begin to manage the change process themselves. So I think it's this combination of sequencing and, hitting those really relevant issues for people, and also this higher education piece, which always and unfortunately falls through the cracks.
Great. So I think we'll pass to you, Brady, to identify some additional questions from BIFAD.
Okay. Yes, and yes. Let me turn to my colleagues,
okay.
And we had. If you don't mind, if you would come up here, and we'll, as long as you're comfortable there, we'll go ahead even a bit longer, perhaps,
okay.
Using you. But this last question, Nancy, you've been emphasizing is one, as you may know, BIFAD has emphasized throughout the last several years of the need to build partnership institutions, because that's the capacity we ultimately have to provide. I loved your term, the leadership machines. So, Pamela, did. Are we live here?
You can hear me.
Yes, we
No,
I think this one is working.
but your audience outside can't.
Oh, right. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. So thank you for taking your time to share all of this with us. I have a nerdy question that's related to an operational question. And the more nerdy question is on scale. So you, Greg, especially referred a lot to scale, scaling up, scale agents. And it's interesting because there's also been some tensions with that, which you pointed out at the end, is like, you know, the problems with getting this incorporated at a national level. Perhaps it's a local issue. Should we be thinking, and again, you know, when you target scaling, would it be a geopolitical scale? Would it be a target around the population that is being affected by these shocks and stresses? And what does that mean when you're looking at covariate and sequential shocks that overlap in different ways? So, I mean, have you been grappling with that? And or should we be thinking about scaling out? Because the comments that you were just making is, instead of thinking like we usually do with adoption, that we need to scale up everything, what if these are learning endeavors? And then what you're scaling out is an approach. Yeah. And then for me, that links back to the operational discussion. That would be the rich territory to be teaching the new generation about this approach. And then how do we, as donors, use resources to help get this into institutions both domestically and abroad? So instead of that ambition that we always have of getting it up and everywhere, because this is what killed us with farmer field schools. The chief economist at the World Bank killed us because he said, it's too resource intensive, we don't have the money, you can't do this anymore. And basically that potential empowerment tool just got truncated. So I mean, so it's a operational question, but also an academic question.
Yeah, and I think a question we sort of face every day. I will say my one realization over the last 5 years, I think large donors like USAID can actually get confused and think that they are the scale agent. We bring enough resources to bear that we can be significant. And what ends up as a result of that is a very projectized view of the world, where I'm interested in the outcomes of my project. The 33,000 households, I increased the income by 373, and not seeing the value of that investment was demonstrating to a sort of now fairly solid technocratic level within a partner government what's possible, and they then scale to cover 8 million people. So I think this is part of what our new administrator, Mark Green, talks about when he talks about a longer-term vision, not thinking of projects as the end in themselves, but thinking of them as tools to facilitate the sharing and shifting of responsibility, not thinking this is a 5-year project cycle vision, that this has to be a long-term vision. But he's made clear to us, and I think part of the reason resilience has resonated with him so much is that progress against that vision is the measure of success, not what did your project do, what your project. So I do take to heart also the intensity of investments required. When we're talking about why this works in northern Kenya or certain parts of Ethiopia, it's a safety net with market systems interventions, with health and education interventions. We're now introducing health insurance in that same area, with conflict and governance investments. So it can't be everything, but it's not going to be one thing. And so this isn't about scaling up one technology, but it's saying what combination of technologies, market systems facilitation, governance investment, and a little bit to get back to Tobela's question about scales that is, you know, national versus local. The one place this really seems to all come together is at this sort of meso level, sort of county level. Now, I do think we need to be working at regional level, so we can't just be focused on bilateral relationships and investment in Kenya and Ethiopia separately. There are regional issues, and we partner and work with EGAD and others on that. We actually chair a global alliance of donors supporting that regional view. But the more you go down bilateral, county level in the case of Kenya, the more this resonates and makes sense. And I do think we have an interesting role as donors to play as innovators and helping people, sort of stimulating, de-risking some of these things, not only for governments, but for the private sector. You think about Somalia and people say, well, how do you scale there with the capacity of government? There's an interesting practice on a fairly small scale called camel leasing, where vulnerable households actually lease a camel to large-scale commercial dairies on the outskirts of Mogadishu. In return, they get $200 to $300 to get them through the drought. They get an animal returned to them at the end of the drought that's been fed, given veterinary services, and the commercial dairies are profiting because of the high demand for milk in Mogadishu. So our ability to help facilitate a scaling, we're not going to scale it ourselves, but linking and expanding that practice is just the sort of kind of investments we can make when we have a willing but not fully capable government partner.
So catalytic investment.
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, just an observation. Thank you very much for the presentations that have been made. Would like to make a point of the knowledge sharing from Tim and Nancy at different points that have been raised, and see if I can relate that to the question that Kwesi had made. I think it was you, Tim, that said that sectoral research and resilient research don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. And you said that stresses are everywhere and at different levels and different intensities, and it's a matter of priority and identifying those and to learn as much as we can about them and share our knowledge base on how that could be used to change the sectoral research that is being done, modify that, and could be effective. I think it was Nancy that said that we have learned a lot and there's a lot to be learned, and maybe one of the things that we need to do is begin to how to build the how-to part, the how to build resilience. And that gave me a notion. I mean, I'm a biological scientist and worrying about technology generation and how that technology with the power of markets and the private sector would bring about livelihood change in the communities. That's what I worry about. And so the question that was raised was, we live in a world with limited resources, and it's we tend to with different sectors we tend to be thinking that we're zero-sum game. But we also recognize that our world is not perfect, and there are a lot to be learned from competitive sectors and so on. And the value addition that would come out of resilience research, I think I fully recognize, and many of my colleagues do. So how do you decide, and do we continue to invest so we can learn the decision-making of the farmers and the challenges they face, the stresses they live with, and the adjustment they make, and observe that to the best that we can, so we generate the knowledge base and to bring about for solving solutions? Or do we divide that into two and look for the limited resources that would build the knowledge base, but at the same time to really justify whether or not this knowledge base generated can make a difference? Begin to build team partnership and work together in the manner in which Nancy was talking about. And for me, it's a lot easier to engage biological scientists in social science research, not when you're trying to learn about the nature of the problem, but how to begin to begin solutions and so on. The how-to part, it's a lot easier to build partnership and bring scientists together, both physical and social scientists working together. So I think, I don't have an answer to this, but I raise this and to see what your observation is on how we can really build partnerships to address. We're all in it together. We're all trying to solve the same basic problem. But I think we go through the paradigms, and a lot of resources are invested, and we learn quite a bit. But at the same time, have we moved the needle for the smallholder farmer? And that's our responsibility, and that's our obligation. We'll just leave it at that.
Well, I have to, this is, again, showing how old I am. The first time I met Dr. Gabisa was 1981 in Sudan, when he was a sorghum researcher, and I was out doing farming systems research, in the El Obeid region. And he asked us one day, you know, you're going to all these villages, maybe you could pick up some varieties of sorghum while you're out there and just label where you got it. And so we did, and we ended up with like 120 different varieties, which he then was able to take and create a new variety that was then spread across all of that region of Africa. So it's a classic example where two people from different disciplines actually can work together to solve a problem, and the main problem he was working on was bird-resistant sorghum. And so, so I think I'm encouraged by that kind of stuff, and I think it is the right way to go in terms of having a problem-solving partnership, you know, but each contributing different sets of knowledge to that partnership that will help it work.
Yeah, I would add something. I was involved in another higher education partnership program, was involved with the One Health initiative. So we were bringing together research teams, African research teams around One Health problems that involved both behavioral and you know, sort of medical and veterinary issues. And we actually, I mean, you can set up programs that incentivize that kind of behavior, cross-disciplinary team building and so forth. And it was one of the most inexpensive projects I think I've ever worked on. It was $500,000 over 2 years. It activated teams in several countries, and you know, it worked, and it had some sustainability to it. Those teams continued to work on problems over time, and cross-country problems. So I think that we can, again, goes back to how we do things.
Yeah.
We can incentivize that type of behavior.
I would just add, maybe as a way of closing out this panel, so I think the challenge is, so we invested in research at the Overseas Development Institute on this poverty dynamics, the rate at which people move out of poverty only to fall back. Our purpose was to show the broader relevance of resilience beyond areas subject to recurrent crisis. And it is absolutely relevant for every sectoral outcome we're trying to achieve, every country we work in. But there was something about being in Nairobi in 2011, 2012, something triggered not only amongst donors, but governments in the region, communities, private sector. There was a forcing moment, or an urgency around the scale of recurrent crisis. Now we're seeing big drought emergencies again, so the solution isn't there, but it did enable this thing you're talking about, Gabisa, about a sort of motivating problem that we need everybody to come together on. And I think that's what's been amazing about Kenya and its ending drought emergencies, 6 pillars that work across several ministries. It's amazing about some of the work being done in Ethiopia is there was this urgency, this sort of forcing mode, this problem set that we didn't have the luxury to research forever about, that we had to do research on the fly, apply the lessons learned, scale, implement. And that's why I always love that example of the index-based livestock insurance. Small research investment, demonstrate potential, scaled by government with a private sector partner, paying out in the midst of a drought emergency now, allowing vulnerable households to manage through the drought and restock as drought conditions subside. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Oh, Greg, thank you, and thanks to the panel very much. Let's give them a big round of applause for a wonderful job. Let me just say, make a few sort of summary comments on the day, and they aren't intended to be summarized, but I want to turn to questions that you have, and you've been very patient. We've had a lot of questions generated today. We also have the people online who may want to ask questions. I was looking for Samantha back. Yes, so you probably have some questions, okay, coming in. But, we've had some really stimulating and exciting discussion today as Beth Dunford laid out the Global Food Security Act and the role that Euro Food Security and USAID generally is undertaking. This panel has been phenomenal in Greg's presentation, the other presentations and responses from the panel, and clearly pointing to something BIFAD is very interested in, that is a significantly expanded role for universities in analyzing some of these critical issues that have been brought forward. I think that was sort of called for across the way. Now, How that gets paid for and done is another question, but the measurement issues, the systematic approach to draw on our multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of approach to research is clearly being called for. We've also heard this emphasis on the movement out of poverty and then falling back into poverty. Now, we didn't get to fully explore that question, but it's an issue where we've dealt with it in this country as well, and many countries of the world. And one important point is those who go out of poverty, it may be a different group who falls back into poverty. That's certainly been the issue in our country a great deal. I was very intrigued to hear the issue of the devolution of power. And of course, in my mind, having grown up in eastern Kentucky and the edge of the coal fields and studied the Appalachian Regional Commission over the years, that was a creative partnership between a federal, state, and local government set of entities that sought to bring this knowledge base to bear at the local level. And so there might be an interesting aspect of the model, worth discussing there, worth looking at as we go forward. I think it's clear that there's important roles for the NGOs, the business sector, the cooperative sector, the entrepreneurship sector, to draw on some of those strengths that are coming back as we look at the behavioral aspects of economics and psychology that have been, Nancy, I believe you emphasized that a great deal. But earlier today was talking about how the newest Nobel laureate, Thaler, in economics, has really drawn on the behavioral aspect so much that it has called renewed attention to an approach that could actually stimulate a great deal more effective transdisciplinary kind of work in our universities. And when I say universities, I'm really talking about that leadership machine. It's obviously in the agencies, it's in the NGOs, it's in everywhere that continual stream of human capital that universities are all about at the tertiary level, you might say. We don't act alone. We act with families in preschool, with primary education, secondary education, higher education, and then graduate and professional training. And you emphasized a very important point and Greg, it speaks to the leadership you've provided in USAID, that emphasis on bringing these pieces together and changing the way we think about the issues has been demonstrated to be far more effective as a rate of return than any specific training and management. There's been new research coming along that I gathered several of you were familiar with that really emphasize that point. So it really tells us we need to rethink some things, and we need to make sure that we're bringing the different the areas of our academic world, our agency world, into partnership in our thinking. And then most importantly, it seems to me, is the point that Nancy, you kept emphasizing, we have to have partners around the world that we're engaged with in undertaking this work. Because to the extent that we have not developed an institution that can carry forward with this research and education, we're really shortchanging the potential investment from that country in those institutions who change the way they think and operate and move forward with new enterprise stimulation. So those were just some things I felt sort of compelled to say as I looked at my notes and listened to this panel discussion that we just heard here particularly. Let me at this point now turn to the audience. We've had several questions, and we'll go to the audience first for some questions and then discussion, then we will go to those online as well. Rick.
Great. My name is Richard Connor. What is missing and who is missing? So what is missing from your resilience models and who is missing from helping you, particularly asking you to think creatively? Just one example is I know that BIFAD worked heavily with the intelligence community.
Sorry, would you mind if we can use the mic, it will help get us this on record. Sorry.
Usually I'm relatively loud, but my name's Richard Kammeyer. My question is, what is missing from the resilience model and who is missing from helping you with it? Asking you to think creatively outside the box of academia. One example, the intelligence community is heavily involved in resilience modeling with the technology community, looking at what kind of causation factors that might not normally be thought of lead to extremism, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Let's get several questions. Very excellent question you've raised here. Did you have a question? Earlier you did. Okay. Didn't want to put you on the spot. But, any other questions in the room right now pressing? Yes.
Carrie Lajeunesse again, thank you. So along those same lines, when we're trying to engage the private sector, say for small solar microgrids, so that we can enable resilience, how do we bring folks in other sectors, other industries that are critically needed for, say, electrifying Africa? How do we bring them up to speed on the knowledge base that they need to effectively engage development partners, humanitarian assistance partners, whoever that might be, so that we can get the best of the products that are out there to support these efforts for resilience?
Other questions? We'll take this one, then we'll maybe ask for some discussion here and then go online.
Anthony Zui from University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. There's been lots of very interesting contributions and presentations today. I didn't hear the word SDGs mentioned, and I'm just interested in whether some of these global initiatives around development, around leaving no one behind, around partnerships, around working in a more joined up way, are taken on board and given serious attention, or whether in a sense the approach is primarily within existing sort of silos and current activities and initiatives. So I'd be interested really to explore, hear some sort of views on how those global and perhaps nationally led initiatives intersect. Thank you.
I'll start off now. Just a brief response to the last question, and we had no other, I think, pressing right now, and then we'll ask the board here to at least engage in discussion with the three questions that were asked here. But I think you've raised a very good question. There's a lot we're talking about, of course, beyond just this meeting. This meeting is focused on resilience because it was a particular interest of BIFAD in seeing where we were and where we feel we need to go and what steps perhaps can be taken in the advisory role that we play with USAID. So we had this spelled out here very well from the work that Greg represents in spearheading it. Actually, a year ago at this meeting, we focused on the strategic development goals, I think that was a year ago, I believe, wasn't it? When we really spent a great deal of time on that. So there's nothing that we do in our emphasis that suggests anything with regard to what USAID may necessarily be doing. I just want to make sure that distinction is there, that we're interested in looking at the whole picture. We choose certain areas that we feel we need to explore, emphasize, and then bring resources from wherever it is in the world to bear on what U.S. government is doing. And we play a role in at least advocating and suggesting areas of impact there. So with that, let me turn to other. I won't try to address every issue here, but Pamela, you want to?
We actually we had breakfast with Tim this morning, and we actually asked that same question, and maybe I'll put him on the spot because the question was, how is this concept being embraced or not across the donor community, and where is there space for it in the SDGs? Tim?
Well, yeah, I think what's been really interesting watching over the last 5, 6 years, 7 years, all of the major donors are very much focused on resilience now. And so the U.S. government is investing heavily in it, the EU is investing heavily in it, so is BIFAD. So one of the big issues there is, and there has been movement towards trying to get the three donors to work more closely together on these things so that they don't duplicate each other's efforts, that they actually are working in complementary ways in different countries. And so there's been some positive movement in that regard. The second thing, with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals, they were fairly loosely defined when they were put together. So one of the big issues that governments are facing is actually how to operationalize those things. And so this is where the resilience work actually does play a role at the country level. And so we're trying to make sure that when we talk about, these positive well-being outcome measures, that we're taking the ability to manage shocks and stresses into account when we talk about achieving those objectives. And so there's a real opportunity. Governments are open to this idea, and Greg can speak to that, particularly in places where we've been doing this work. So I think that it's almost like we have a blank slate to start with, and so we have a real opportunity to actually influence that in terms of the way things are measured at the country level.
Great, thanks.
So I think, I remember at the onset of the discussion around the SDGs, it was like people were saying, well, where's the resilience SDG? I tell you that would have been a fundamental mistake. Resilience is not an outcome. It's a set of capacities to achieve and sustain an outcome given the complex risk environments in which we work. So it's essential, and I think key donors are attuned to the fact that it's an essential set of investments we have to make to not only achieve the SDGs, but sustain them over time. Particularly if we look at poverty. I mean, the interesting thing about the data we had on poverty backsliding is it was panel data. So this was people literally escaping poverty and falling back, same households. So I think it's not explicit enough in the SDG framework, and that's going to be a challenge. On the who's missing, what's missing, I think that's a really important question. As I cited as a frontier area for us, working in fragile areas, particularly when they were talking extremely fragile, northeastern Nigeria. We are very much, our DoD colleagues are very interested in what we're doing and what we're, the resilience approach. They're even more interested that we're putting long-term development investments in some of these places that we'd long time dismissed as sort of perpetual humanitarian basket cases. So they are very much intrigued by what we're doing. Over the course of the year, we've briefed all the combatant commands. We featured, resilience featured very high in an AFRICOM strategic dialogue. So it's very much about connecting with those groups. Now, the term resilience is, I've heard it called a fuzz word. It's loose enough that when you're talking with different communities of actors who don't normally play in the same sandbox, you find the terms are used in very different ways. So that's kind of where we're at with that challenge. I think we both recognize the need to come together, the intelligence community, the security community, the DoD, what we're doing on resilience.
Can I just respond to this? What Greg just said made me remember something. I mean, looking back at this just over the last decade, there was a long period of time where we were actually going in and I mean we, the community, right, targeting the poorest of the poor, saying how do we dig in and really try to crack these intractable challenges. And then there was a flip that I noticed, I don't know, probably about 2010-ish, where there were a lot of donors that started looking at what they would call breadbasket areas and really, I think, getting frustrated with the fact that we weren't getting traction and saying, okay, let's look at where you have the best scenario for progress, and let's invest there. And that was hard. And in the donor community, you saw almost a dialectic, because it was almost like giving up and saying, well, we can't do anything here. We're not making traction. Let's go put our money where we can get success, because the accountability was, as you said, for the donor. And so what you're really doing, I think, with this approach is you're taking us back to where we need to focus if we're going to deal with some of the, in partnership with some of these intractable development issues. But you know, that actually is something you really, this is the first time I realized this, and I've been sort of reading and listening and coming along with you for the last year. That point to me is a major sea shift. And you might want to elevate that in the discussions a little more, because that's big.
I just think, coming back to this question about the intel defense sector and so forth, I think the discussions have started to happen, at least as far as I'm aware. And the IT technology sector in general has a lot to offer to resilience, all the way from education and training platforms to telechat vehicles that let you get into low bandwidth areas and so forth. So there's a lot that we can draw in, and we're starting to do that. But perhaps because of the fact that many of the areas that we're in are not data-rich areas, it's a little bit slow on the uptake.
That's the other problem with those areas.
Did you have anything?
No, just I don't have anything in reference to the questions that have been asked, but I wanted to make an additional point to a point that Nancy made and you accentuated, and that is about this leadership machine and the investment in higher education, tertiary education in developing countries, and the value that can be added in the partnership between advanced universities in developed world with those in developing countries, because of the point that you made and the value that is added, and that is that, as you indicate in your reference with this leadership machine, that in any country, the leadership is very often come from those people who in college education. And the thing that worries me as a person from a developing country is that there is a proliferation of investments by developing countries in higher education investment, which is very good. But at the same time, students are coming in large numbers, and the capacity of faculty and infrastructure for education and research is so poor, they're producing individuals with limited skills and capacities. And so moving forward, 15, 20 years from now, these are the individuals that are going to be leaders in these countries. And so if it is challenging and difficult enough and a cause for conflicts and problems today, imagine the kinds of problems that we have down the road. And so I just, for the record, wanted to make this connection between the point that you made and what I also fully agree about the need for investments in strengthening higher education institutions in developing countries.
And they're not very expensive. And this is, I think, a point that needs to be made by BIFAD. It is relative to a lot of other investments we make. The higher education investment, higher education sector investment is pretty low. I mean, I worked on building a school of public health in Rwanda. It was really much more than $11 million. And it's a sustainable institution, doing applied research and some basic research, now even NIH research. It's, churning out master's and doctoral students at a fairly high level every year. So it's cheap and it's very effective.
Thank you.
The excellent point, and it seems to me that the higher education community may be finding some new ways of addressing this issue. I mean, funding is always a challenge, but it's, excuse me, it's the mindset also that can be a real challenge. I know in the work I'm doing at the University of Missouri, the collaboration across colleges is significantly enhanced, and work that's being done, say, in Rwanda or in Ghana, and you have the medical school, nursing school, working more with the sociologist or the economist, the agricultural scientist, to try to integrate some of their finding. And there's probably a dozen different funding sources at least at work there, including NGO to NGO kind of relationships that get stimulated by students themselves because of their colleagues around the world. And I think there is some steps that can be taken there that we haven't formalized at all. Maybe we shouldn't, but at least we ought to be aware of them. And in some ways, it links up with being aware, and Rick Kratmeyer implied this a moment ago, with the various sources of data we have from all the different agencies. And I know there were several in this room who were very involved in the Ebola crisis. So Carrie Lejeunesse, a moment ago, talking about that, who was very involved with Congress on that issue. And there were massive amounts of data being developed that weren't being used strategically. And I was never sure exactly, to be honest with you, whether it was the ownership of it or our ability to think in big data terms. Now that's changing rapidly, it seems to me, and the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition initiative that is still going on strongly worldwide as the potential of being one venue or one lever where more of this can be done. But clearly, more data from the various dimensions of the private sector or the cooperative sector or the NGO sector, in which data sharing has not been inherent in our DNA. And it's just a shame when you see the potential for having an impact on people in a positive way when data isn't shared then in a way that could be extremely beneficial. Let's go to the online questions, Samantha, if we could.
I have one from Twitter and one from AgriLinks. So to start with the one from Twitter, it's integrated models of resilience require long-term and integrated thinking. How can this be promoted in a short-term fluctuating policy environment? And our question from AgriLinks is from Gretchen Noth, who is with Crown Agents USA. And she's interested in hearing from the panelists on how resilience strategies vary depending on whether the shock is systemic or widespread, such as drought, versus localized at the household level, like the death of a family member, an income earner. Do you see a distinction between these two responses, or are the solutions more fluid?
Well, we're going to be drawing the panel back in on that second question, but maybe we can go to it first. Or the bigger policy question was how do we get the long-term strategic thinking? I think we're all groping with that, and I feel like what we've talked about today may be actually one set of tools that will enable us to take that longer-term view. And we can talk more about this because there's various strategies involved of going back to some of the basic disciplines and moving forward, and then reaching out and bringing in, but integrating, ensuring measurement, and someone said a complex systems approach to all that we're talking about here. But let's turn, if we could, to any responses from the panel then on the second question that was asked.
Well,
yes.
Just quickly, for sure, the strategies are somewhat different for idiosyncratic, that is, household level risk and covariate risks, and of course different covariate risks. But for the idiosyncratic, bonding social capital is actually, is doable, and it's certainly, strengthening savings and loans groups and traditional organizations and so forth does tend to work for that.
So I think there is definitely sort of shock capacities needed to deal with particular shocks, but there are also capacities that help deal with a range of shocks. I think one of the challenges we've had as development professionals is we tend to slice risk up in one slice at a time. This group deals with climate risk, and these people deal with health risk. That's how people experience shocks and stresses. They experience the totality. So I think it's understanding those which transcend different shock types, but knowing that there's some kind of capacities that have to be built specific to particular shocks. And we do this in a probabilistic manner. We're not building capacity to withstand earthquakes in northern Kenya, for example. So I think you've got to be tailored. It's not a generic approach. I won't get myself in too deep a water on the first question, but I will say I've been extremely heartened by Administrator Mark Green's vision for helping countries build capacity over time to deal with these challenges themselves. It's why resilience resonates so much with him, I believe. And I think that there is, when I look at Kenya, I always point to Kenya because I was based in Garissa in the 90s, so it's my touch point. They have a vision 2022 for this, and that's their first phase. So it's their vision that can be a sort of a beacon of stability in policy, and while we sort of deal with our own resilience challenges here.
What I would love to see for the educators in the room is to make a systems thinking course an absolute requirement, as important as English. And that's not a joke. I mean, we're still, when you start talking about, there's still the glaze over factor. I mean, this stuff is so interesting. It is so fascinating. It is so powerful. And yet, because the way we are educated is so disciplinary and compartmentalized, I still think we don't have enough young people being exposed to the excitement and the power and the potential of this way of thinking. And I think that is on the curricula and the universities to actually have those discussions and start to make this obligatory, because we're not going to crack these problems. And what you're talking about is the people that come after 2022. Those are the people that are studying now, right? That's the leadership machine. We're not tooling them properly for what we're going to ask them to do in the next 10 to 15 years.
I would say I agree, and I teach a class, an undergraduate class on resilience and systems thinking, and also have a module on that in my graduate classes in public health. Public health used to have systems thinking as a core course. That got eliminated, but I think it's going to come back after this last iteration of public health reforms. But absolutely, we have to, it's a mindset issue, you know, and we have to change the mindset.
Just trying to earn some brownie points from my fellow board member here. We have created a partnership between Haramain University and Purdue University in climate smart agriculture that's funded by the World Bank. And one of the courses we created is principles and methods of understanding resilience.
That's great. Well done. Thank you.
Tim, were you going to comment?
Well, I was just going to say, it's been interesting. A lot of our work, measurement work, has been in places where we do have large covariate shocks. But we've been asked by people in Asia, for example, where you may not have a large covariant shock that hits that area, but they experience a lot of idiosyncratic shocks. And so one of the things is they're interested in is, does the measurement system look slightly different when you've got that kind of a situation versus one where you have these large covariant shocks? And we're working on that right now. So there are different ways to set up the monitoring systems in that regard. It's not so much that a shock that triggers the data collection, you just start tracking things over time anyway, as you see how idiosyncratic shocks are affecting households.
Yes, question, Doug.
Thank you. Grace Burton from the Chicago Council. I would just like to ask you to emphasize one bit, which is that we were really delighted when the resilience numbers out of Ethiopia came out a couple months ago. As we talked to the Hill and as we talked to people in Washington, that is an extremely helpful type of outcome, showing that, if for anyone that doesn't know, it's showing that farmers in Feed the Future were more resilient than farmers outside of Feed the Future when they're facing the famine in Ethiopia. And that was incredibly helpful as we're building the narrative around why Feed the Future and USAID is so important in this space. The question that I have, it ties into what Gabisa was talking about and a couple of others around the data, is when you're thinking about universities and you're thinking about extension, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is how do you get the data from the farmers? So it shouldn't just be one way of getting the technology out, but how do you get that data to then put it into GoDan or to this other information to really reach these areas where where it's not data rich? So thoughts around that would be really helpful.
Well, let me say, we all have had different approaches on how to get data, to go to your point. The panel that we just had, of course, we're dealing with a lot of data from a lot of different research projects and efforts that have been undertaken. And perhaps it'd be worth just touching that a bit from the panel, if you'd be willing to share. The sources of data you were using were individualized data, household data, randomized controlled trials in some cases. So, I mean, going out and talking to the farmers with people who speak their language and are from their culture is the most effective way I've found in getting data from farmers. You don't get it by strangers, or you don't get it from someone from a village that speaks usually a different language or brings a different culture to bear on it. But that's the simplistic kind of an answer. What was the multiplicity, just in a nutshell, of sources of data that you all used, farm-level data?
Okay, so in many of the, Greg can speak to this, but many of the kind of priority resilience countries that AID is working in, they've been collecting primary data, baseline, midterm, endline kind of data that is basically, some of it is being collected using randomized control trials, some of it is more quasi-experimental, but the point is we try to get a control group that we're comparing the results to. But one of the biggest problems we have in the data collection, and particularly with regards to trying to say it was this intervention that was making the difference, a lot of these places that we're actually collecting the data, there's other organizations that are implementing programs there. So it's very difficult to give full attribution to the actual projects that we're trying to measure. But they're not trying to do that. They're actually trying to look at contribution that they're actually making to those households. And so, so I don't think, as long as we try to find out who's been working there, what kinds of interventions are going on there, we can still say something about what happened in that community. The other thing that I think I want to really emphasize is we don't take advantage of data that we already have. And we are sitting on, a lot of times data is collected, you know, a baseline is done, you know, almost as compliance for a project, and then it's not looked at again. And what we want to do is we want to take those data sets and re-examine them from a resilience lens. And we can learn a lot from that. So we've been doing that in Malawi, we've been doing that in Bangladesh, we've been doing that in Zimbabwe, and we're finding all kinds of really interesting information about resilience that people just hadn't taken time to actually reanalyze the data from that lens. So we believe that there's a lot of data out there that has been underutilized and can actually have informed quite a bit about what's going on in the areas, particularly data sets that are collected by the World Bank on the LSMS type stuff. So we're trying to take advantage of that. I don't know, you want to say something?
Sure. I think just on that last point, that whole body of research we did on poverty backsliding, right now we've got case studies for Uganda, Ethiopia, Bangladesh. We're now doing in Philippines, which is really interesting because it compares rural versus urban. We're also doing in Kenya. We're doing in Niger. This isn't data we're collecting. This is all LSMS panel data. I think the existence in the more common finding of panel data is making a lot of this easier. But it is going in and analyzing the data differently. And what I didn't talk to about in that poverty backsliding research is, in addition to looking at the rate of backsliding, we went back into the data to explain why some households escape poverty and remain out, why other households escape and fall back. A lot more data collection is becoming much more routine to collect shock data. So a lot of the LSMS are collecting shock data, not just did you experience a drought, but a whole module on different types of idiosyncratic and covariate shocks. So I feel like we're sitting on a mountain and we've only etched the surface in terms of what it can tell us. And this is already having an influence over policy and programming.
And there are big data streams available, environmental data, and I think we're increasingly incorporating those into household level data sets so that we're actually integrating some of these rich historical data streams. I think the private sector data is probably the most problematic data, call data records and so forth.
It seems like such a sensible way to proceed, to actually look at the information that exists and then let you generate the questions and say, okay, we need more data here. It can be coarse-grained, or we need the fine-grained data here. And actually, because our first response is always, we need more money for more data. And we just, again, don't have the resources to keep going down that path. So, I mean, the kind of insights that you can provide on complex system theory, you're always asking what data and coarse-grained, fine-grained, you know, and what don't we need to worry about. So, I mean, that seems like another really important contribution that could come out of this body of work.
So one of the other things I just wanted to say here is we created a technical working group on resilience measurement that FAO, WFP, IFPRI, and a number of 20 different organizations were part of. And AID has been a big part of helping to fund that. And the advantage of that is that we can, the World Bank was on that team, and so we can actually influence the modules that the bank actually collects by showing what we don't have so we could do the good resilience analysis. So now they're adding more stuff to these data collection efforts that they're doing. And so now they're going to collect the data anyway, but now we have data that we can actually analyze from a resilience perspective.
Okay. Any other comments there or from the panel? Yes, Samantha, any further questions come in? Okay, any further questions here? I'm double checking. Yes. This has been a fabulous discussion, and let me just again thank the panel for your role and for continuing to stay with us throughout on this discussion. It's been fabulous. And I think from a BIFAD perspective, my own perspective is we really achieved what we had hoped to achieve from the standpoint of our own learning and from exposing what was going on with resilience to a broader audience here and online today. And that was very much part of what we want. And we've generated a whole series of follow-up initiatives, it seems to me, that we will be undertaking. So as the data, I hope BIFAD can be kept informed. As additional analyses occur, please share it with us, because we will be following this closely and, of course, interacting with USAID on it, and we will obtain it, I'm sure, in various ways that way. But unless there's other further comments, Pamela, Gabisa, and I think we lost Harold a little bit earlier, our other BIFAD member who was online phone with us earlier. Thanks to all of you in the audience and those online as well for being part of this dialogue. And we're excited about the Scientific Awards of Excellence that Gabisa talked about earlier and what that has meant. And one of these days we'll do a summary of that, because we've had some fantastic people with big impacts that we have been able to recognize, and we appreciate what everyone does out there toward that. And again, a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the World Food Prize laureate this year here in Des Moines. So thank you all for being here, and with that, we will conclude the session. Thank you.
Very good. That was really fun.
That's great.
I'll watch your phone.
That was me, yeah. I'll come back.
Good. Where do you go tonight? How about tomorrow night?
Tomorrow night I'm having dinner with Sarah. She was one of my deputies in May. She was the chairman.
I was going to invite you to a Purdue reception.